Welcome, weary traveler of the modern world. Tonight, we journey not to the marble halls of emperors or the thunderous roar of the Colosseum, but to the quieter, more intimate corners of ancient Rome places, where ordinary people lived, breathed, and endured the weight of daily existence. Settle yourself comfortably now, and imagine you could step through time itself, leaving behind your climate-controlled world of private bathrooms and filtered water, of antibiotics and personal space. Tonight, you'll discover why the simple act of taking a bath in ancient Rome might have tested every fiber of your modern sensibilities. We'll walk together through the steamy, crowded chambers of a Roman therme, where relaxation came with a price few today would willingly pay. We'll sit in the shadows with Seneca the Younger, watching a brilliant mind navigate the treacherous waters of imperial favor. We'll descend into the mysterious underground temples of Mithras, where torch-lit rituals bound men together in secret brotherhood. And finally, we'll climb the marble steps to the palatial homes of Rome's elite, where privilege came wrapped in silk and strangled by expectation. Let the rhythm of these ancient lives wash over you like warm water, carrying you gently toward rest. In the end, you may find that the distance between their world and ours is both vast and surprisingly small. Imagine yourself standing at the entrance to the baths of Caracalla on a sweltering afternoon in the 2nd century. The massive bronze doors, each weighing more than a cart horse and polished to a mirror finish by generations of hands, swing open before you with a groan that speaks of centuries yet to come. Immediately, your senses are assaulted by a wall of humid air, thick with the mingled scents of olive oil, sweat, and something else. Something you can't quite identify, but that makes your stomach turn slightly. It's the smell of human bodies in various states of cleanliness and decay, mixed with the metallic tang of heated bronze pipes and the earthy odor of wet stone that has absorbed decades of moisture and human habitation. The sound hits you next like a physical force, hundreds of voices echoing off marble walls and vaulted ceilings that soar 40 feet above your head, creating a din that reverberates through your bones and makes your teeth ache. Men arguing over dice games with the passion of senators debating war merchants, hawking their wares and voices hoarse from a day's shouting. The splash and slap of bodies moving through water with all the grace of drowning cattle, the sharp crack of wooden strigils scraping against skin like some barbaric percussion instrument. Children shriek with delight or terror. It's impossible to tell which in this cacophony. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the rhythmic grunting of men engaged in wrestling matches, their bodies slapping against the wet marble with sounds that make you wince. This is not the spa-like sanctuary you might have imagined, but something closer to a combination of marketplace, gymnasium, and madhouse. You pay your quadrans a copper coin worth, perhaps, a quarter of a day's wages for a laborer, though the slave collecting coins eyes you with the calculating gaze of someone determining exactly how much more he might extract from an obvious foreigner and step inside. The attendant, a grizzled man whose left ear appears to have been partially bitten off in some long-ago altercation, grunts something that might be directions or might be a curse. His Latin is thick with an accent you can't place, possibly Germanic or Gallic, and his teeth are stained black with wine and neglect. The tepidarum, the worn room, stretches before you like a vast, steamy cavern carved from the belly of some ancient beast. The ceiling disappears into shadows punctuated by the flickering light of oil lamps that cast dancing figures on the wall's shadows that might be men or might be demons, depending on your state of mind. Bodies press against bodies in the crowded space with an intimacy that would be criminal in your modern world. A fat merchant's belly brushes against your back as he pushes past, leaving a trail of rancid oil on your skin. A young man, barely old enough to shave, accidentally elbows you in the ribs as he struggles to maintain his footing on the slippery floor. There are no private changing areas, no individual lockers with keys, no neat rows of wooden benches like you might find in a modern gymnasium. Instead, You must trust your belongings to a slave whose honesty is as uncertain as tomorrow, weather, and whose eyes hold the calculating gleam of someone who has mastered the art of selective blindness. This particular slave, a thin man with scars crisscrossing his back like a map of old battles, takes your clothing with the casual indifference of someone who has handled thousands of tunics and knows exactly which ones are worth stealing and which ones will be forgotten by owners too drunk or too dead to reclaim them. The stone benches where men sit to undress are stained with substances you prefer not to contemplate: oil, sweat, wine, and other bodily fluids that have soaked into the porous marble over decades of use. The bench you eventually claim feels warm from the body heat of its previous occupant, a sensation that makes your skin crawl, even as you tell yourself it's preferable to cold stone. Around you, men strip with the casual efficiency of people for whom modesty is a luxury they cannot afford. A carpenter's hands, stained permanently black with wood stain and bearing the scars of 1,000 small accidents, fold his tunic with surprising care. A soldier removes his belt with the practiced motion of someone who has done this 10,000 times in 100 different places, his body bearing the testament of campaigns in Britannia pale scars that speak of barbarian blades and infected wounds that nearly claimed his life. The air itself seems to have weight here, heavy with moisture and the breath of hundreds of bathers, thick enough to chew. It carries not just humidity, but particles, flakes of dead skin, droplets of oil, microscopic debris from bodies both clean and filthy. You find yourself breathing carefully through your nose, trying to filter out whatever contagion might be floating in this soup of human effluvia. The Romans have no understanding of airborne pathogens, no concept of respiratory infection spreading through shared air, but your modern knowledge makes every breath a conscious risk. You notice that many of the men around you bear the marks of hard labor-scarred hands that speak of rope and stone, and metal sun-darkened skin that tells of days spent under the merciless Mediterranean sun muscles carved by necessity rather than leisure. These are not the pristine, perfumed bodies of your modern gymnasium, but the functional physiques of men who earn their bread through physical toil. A blacksmith, his forearms thick as tree trunks and covered with small circular scars from flying sparks, still bears the smell of his forge and his hair coal smoke and heated metal that no amount of scraping will entirely remove. His fingernails are permanently blackened, and his palms bear calluses thick as leather. A dock worker's feet are stained with the mud of the Tiber, and you can see where heavy lifting has left its mark on his shoulders and back. The purple veins in his legs speak of long hours standing on stone wharves, loading and unloading cargo ships from every corner of the empire. As you move deeper into the complex navigating around groups of men engaged in animated conversations about everything from the price of grain to the latest gladiatorial matches, the reality of Roman bathing begins to settle over you like that heavy, humid air. The marble beneath your feet, polished smooth by countless footsteps, has become treacherous with moisture. Men slip and slide with alarming regularity, their naked bodies crashing into walls and each other with sounds that make you cringe. A young aristocrat, recognizable by his soft hands and pale skin, goes down hard near the entrance to the caldorium, his head striking the stone with a sound like a melon dropping. Two slaves drag him aside with the casual indifference of street sweepers removing debris. Whether he's unconscious or dead seems to be of little concern to anyone present. The Romans had no understanding of germs, no concept of bacterial infection, no knowledge of the microscopic warfare being waged in every drop of water around you. The same water that had washed the bodies of dozens before you, laborers with infected cuts, soldiers with festering wounds, slaves with diseases that have no names, would wash yours as well. The heated pools, maintained at temperatures that would make a modern hot tub seem tepid, created perfect breeding grounds for microorganisms that would not be identified for another 15 centuries. Bacteria thrived in this warm, nutrient-rich environment, multiplying exponentially in conditions that modern science would classify as a biological hazard requiring immediate evacuation and decontamination. Picture yourself lowering your body into the caldorium, the hot room, where temperatures often exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit and the humidity approached that of a tropical rainforest. The hypocaust system, that marvel of Roman engineering that heated the floors and walls through a network of hollow spaces filled with hot air, turned this chamber into something approaching a steam oven. Your lungs struggle to process air that seems to contain more water than gas. Sweat begins pouring from your body before you've even entered the water, and you feel the first stirrings of heat exhaustion clouding your vision. The water itself might reach 104 degrees, hot enough to make your heart race and your head swim, hot enough to cook an egg if you had the patience to wait. Around you, men with open cuts and festering sores from their daily labors shared these same pools with the casual indifference of people who have never heard of infection. A gladiator, fresh from the training ground with abrasions from sand and wooden weapons, might slide in beside you, his wounds still weeping fluid that mingles with the communal water. His body bears the marks of his profession, a long scar across his ribs from a practice, bout gone wrong, burns on his arms from torches used in night exhibitions, bite marks on his shoulder from some exotic beast imported for the games. He strikes up a conversation about the upcoming races at the Circus Maximus, while blood from his latest injuries creates tiny crimson clouds in the water around him. A soldier on leave bearing half-healed battle wounds that speak of recent combat in Germania or Dacia might strike up a conversation, as you both soaked in water that had already turned a suspicious shade of brown from the accumulated oil skin particles and bodily fluids of the day's bathers. His stories of campaign life, the long marshes, the bitter cold of northern winters, the fear that comes before battle create a strange intimacy in this overheated chamber. But his wounds, poorly tended by military surgeons more skilled at amputation than healing, leak substances into the shared water that your modern mind recoils from. A deep gash in his thigh, acquired when his horse fell during a cavalry charge, has been stitched with horsehair thread and shows clear signs of infection. The flesh around it is red and swollen, and you can see the telltale red lines of blood poisoning creeping up his leg. The striggling process would test your resolve even further, challenging every assumption you hold about hygiene and personal care. Imagine lying on a marble slab, slick with the oil, and scraped skin of previous bathers literally scraped skin, forming a paste-like substance that coats the stone like some medieval torture device's residue. The marble itself, while beautiful, is porous enough to have absorbed years of human detritus, creating a surface that harbors bacteria and fungi in quantities that would horrify a modern microbiologist. The slab is warm from the hypocaust system, which only encourages the growth of whatever microorganisms have taken up residence in its microscopic pores. A slave or a friend more, likely a professional scraper who earns his living removing the accumulated grime from. Roman bodies drags a curved, bronze blade across your flesh with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has performed this operation thousands of times. The strigil, designed to scrape away oil, sweat, and dead skin, often drew blood from those unaccustomed to its harsh ministrations. The bronze blade, sharpened through use and roughly cleaned between customers with nothing more than a splash of the same contaminated water everyone else was bathing in, removes not just dirt, but often healthy skin as well. The Romans considered this normal, even beneficial, believing that the removal of dead skin would promote health and vitality. You would likely find it barbaric, a form of ritualized self-mutilation performed in the name of cleanliness. The scraping process itself is methodical and thorough. Starting with your arms, the scraper works with long, firm strokes that leave red welts in their wake. The sound is distinctly unpleasant, a grinding, scraping noise that sets your teeth on edge and makes your spine crawl. Oil mixed with dead skin accumulates on the blade, creating a gray-brown paste that the scraper periodically removes by wiping it on a cloth that has clearly not been washed since the reign of Hadrian. The process continues across your chest, down your back, along your legs, leaving you feeling raw and exposed. Small cuts are inevitable, tiny wounds that in this environment become potential entry points for any number of infections. The floors beneath your feet tell their own story of discomfort and danger. Made of marble and stone, polished to a mirror finish for aesthetic reasons, but creating a surface more treacherous than ice when wet, they remain perpetually slick with water, oil, and other substances you prefer not to contemplate. The Romans, in their pursuit of beauty, had created floors that were functionally hazardous. Men regularly slipped and fell, sometimes seriously injuring themselves on the unforgiving surfaces. A broken hip meant months of agony and possible death in an age without effective medical care. A cracked skull could mean immediate death, or worse, a lingering vegetative state that families could neither understand nor treat. There were no liability waivers, no safety regulations, no concept that the providers of public services might bear responsibility for injuries occurring on their premises. A broken bone or a cracked skull was simply part of the risk one accepted when seeking cleanliness. And social interaction, like the risk of being struck by lightning or attacked by bandits. The Romans had a fatalistic approach to such hazards. If the gods wanted you to slip and break your neck in a bathhouse, then that was your fate, and no amount of human intervention could prevent it. But perhaps most disturbing to your modern sensibilities would be the communal latrine attached to many bathhouses, a facility that challenged every notion of privacy and personal dignity you hold dear. Picture a long marble bench with circular holes cut at regular intervals. No partitions between them, no privacy screens, no individual spaces of any kind. 20 or 30 men might sit side by side, conducting business and conversation simultaneously, as if they were sharing a meal rather than performing the most private of bodily functions. The bench itself, worn smooth by countless users, bears stains that speak of decades of use and minimal cleaning. A shallow channel of running water flowed beneath, carrying waste away toward the city's sewer system, that marvel of Roman engineering that still impresses modern hydraulic engineers. But while the waste disappeared, the smell remained, trapped by the same humid air that made the baths so oppressive. The Romans, with their limited understanding of disease transmission, saw nothing problematic about this arrangement. To them, it was efficient, social, and perfectly natural. The idea that bodily functions should be private would have struck them as unnecessarily fastidious, even antisocial. Conversations in the latrine covered the same range of topics as those in the bath's proper politics: business, gossip, philosophy. A senator might discuss the latest developments in the provinces while seated next to a freed slave who offered insights into grain prices. The democracy of shared human need temporarily erased social distinctions in ways that would have been impossible in other settings. Yet the smell, the sounds, the complete absence of privacy would drive most modern individuals to seek relief elsewhere, regardless of the social opportunities. The social dynamics would prove equally challenging to navigate, requiring skills that modern life has not prepared you for. Roman baths were places of networking, deal-making, and gossip, but they were also venues for displaying wealth, status, and cultural sophistication. To remain silent was to mark yourself as either foreign or antisocial, both of which carried social penalties in a society that valued eloquence and gregariousness above almost all other virtues. Conversations flowed as freely as the water, covering everything from politics to personal scandals, from business opportunities to philosophical debates that could last for hours. A merchant might corner you to discuss importing grain from Egypt, while you trying to relax in the tepidarum his breath, heavy with wine and his manner urgent with the desperation of someone whose business ventures are teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. He speaks rapidly, gesticulating with hands that leave oily fingerprints on your arm as he emphasizes his points. His proposal some scheme, involving shipping routes and tax exemptions, requires your immediate attention and investment, despite the fact that you're naked, sweating, and trying to avoid breathing too deeply of the contaminated air around you. A young aristocrat, eager to demonstrate his education and sophistication, might attempt to impress you with his knowledge of philosophy while scraping himself clean in the adjoining alcove. His discourse on Stoicism, delivered in the affected tones of someone who has spent more time reading about virtue than practicing it, mingles with the sounds of his strigil removing the evidence of a night spent in less philosophical pursuits. He quotes Marcus Aurelius, while blood from his self-inflicted scraping mingles with the oil on his skin, creating a grotesque contrast between high-minded rhetoric and base physical reality. Privacy, as you understand it, simply did not exist within the walls of the Thermae. Your body, your conversations, your business dealings, all became public domain the moment you passed through those bronze doors. The concept of personal space shrank to whatever small area you could defend with your elbows and your wits, and even that was constantly under siege from the pressing crowd of other bathers. In the crowded pools, bodies pressed against bodies with an intimacy that would make most modern bathers flee immediately, skin touching skin in ways that were both accidental and unavoidable. The lighting, too, would strain your comfort and challenge your sense of security. These vast spaces relied on oil lamps, dozens of them, their flames flickering constantly in the humid air, creating a dancing pattern of light and shadow that played tricks on the eyes. Natural light filtered through high windows, but it was often insufficient to illuminate the deeper recesses of the complex. Shadows pooled in corners and alcoves like dark water, creating pockets of darkness where anything might happen, and frequently did. Pickpockets worked these shadows with the skill of professional craftsmen, preying on bathers who had let their guard down in the soporific atmosphere of heat and humidity. They moved through the crowds like fish through water, their fingers light as feathers as they relieved distracted citizens of their valuables. The darkness provided perfect cover for their activities, and the noise and chaos of the baths masked any sounds of their victims' distress. A purse might disappear from a pile of clothing, while its owner soaked in the caldarium, or a valuable ring might slip from a finger made slippery with oil and sweat. Occasionally, more serious crimes occurred, assaults that went unnoticed in the chaos and poor visibility, sexual attacks that took advantage of the confusion and darkness, even murders that were discovered only when the pools were finally drained for cleaning. The Romans, with their pragmatic approach to law and order, accepted these risks as part of urban life. They took precautions when they could, but they did not allow fear of crime to prevent them from participating in social institutions they considered essential to civilized life. As the afternoon wore on, the water grew progressively fouler, transforming from merely questionable to genuinely revolting. The morning's relatively fresh supply, heated to perfection and scented with oils, gradually accumulated the detritus of hundreds of users. By mid-afternoon, the pools resembled soup more than water or brown, viscous liquid that clung to skin like syrup and left a film that required vigorous scraping to remove. Dead skin floated on the surface like sea foam, while heavier debris settled to the bottom, creating a slippery, treacherous layer that claimed the footing of unwary bathers. By evening, what had started as merely questionable had become genuinely revolting, a primordial soup that seemed capable of supporting new forms of life. The Romans emptied and refilled their pools irregularly, sometimes going days between cleanings, depending on the season, the availability of fresh water, and the diligence of the bath operators. The concept of continuous water treatment was unknown, and filtration meant settling tanks that removed only the largest debris chunks of dead skin, clumps of hair, lost jewelry, and the occasional small animal that had fallen in and drowned. Chemical disinfection was more than 1,000 years in the future, and the Romans' understanding of water purification extended only to boiling, settling, and straining. They believed that hot water was inherently cleaner than cold water, not understanding that heat could actually encourage the growth of harmful bacteria. Their filtration systems, while ingenious for their time, could not remove the microscopic pathogens that thrived in the warm, nutrient-rich environment of the baths. Your skin, after hours in this environment, would bear the evidence of your ordeal, like a map of your suffering. Rashes from unknown irritants would bloom across your body like poisonous flowers, their red welts marking contact with substances your skin was never meant to encounter. Small cuts from the strigil would sting and throb, their edges already showing signs of infection, as bacteria from the contaminated environment found easy entry into your bloodstream. Perhaps a bacterial infection would be brewing beneath the surface, its symptoms not yet apparent, but its progress inevitable in the absence of antibiotics or proper wound care. The olive oil used for cleansing, while effective at removing dirt and dead skin, often carried its own burden of rancidity and contamination. Stored in large amphora that were cleaned infrequently and inadequately, the oil developed a distinctly unpleasant odor and texture over time. Rancid oil, mixed with the accumulated grime of previous users, created a paste that was more likely to add contamination than remove it. Yet this was considered the height of hygiene, the best available method for maintaining cleanliness in an age that had not yet discovered soap. Yet despite all these hardships and hazards, the Romans not only endured these conditions, they cherished them with a passion that bordered on obsession. The baths represented civilization, community, and culture in ways that modern recreational facilities cannot match. They were places where social barriers dissolved, at least temporarily, where a freed slave might rub shoulders with a senator's son and engage him in conversation as an equal. The democratic nature of shared nudity and shared discomfort created opportunities for social mobility that were rare in the rigidly hierarchical Roman world. The discomforts you would find unbearable, they accepted as the natural price of cleanliness and companionship, necessary sacrifices to maintain their place in civilized society. To be excluded from the baths was to be excluded from Roman life itself, cut off from the networks of information, influence, and opportunity that flowed through these steamy chambers, like the heated water itself. A man who could not afford the modest entrance fee, or who was banned for antisocial behavior, found himself isolated from the very heart of Roman culture. The wealthy, of course, had alternatives that allowed them to avoid the worst aspects of public bathing. Private baths in their own homes offered refuge from the masses, smaller facilities that operated on the same principles, but served only family members, trusted friends, and favored slaves. These private thermae could be heated to more comfortable temperatures, filled with cleaner water, and maintained according to their owner's preferences. The water could be changed daily if desired, the oils could be of the finest quality, and the attendants could be chosen for their skill and discretion, rather than their willingness to work for minimal wages. But even these smaller facilities operated on the same basic principles as their public counterparts, and they carried their own unique dangers. The same hypocaust system that made the public baths possible, that marvel of engineering that forced heated air through hollow walls and floors, could turn a private bath into an oven, if not carefully managed. The temperature controls were primitive, consisting mainly of dampers and vents that required constant attention to maintain safe conditions. Many wealthy Romans died from overheating in their own bathhouses. Overcome by temperatures, they could not easily escape once the hypocaust system reached full operation. The design of private baths often emphasized luxury over safety, with smaller rooms that trapped heat more efficiently, but also more dangerously. Wealthy Romans, accustomed to having slaves manage every aspect of their daily lives, sometimes failed to understand the mechanical systems that heated their baths. They would order higher temperatures without understanding the risks, or they would remain in overheated rooms too long because no one dared to tell them it was dangerous. The result was often fatal aristocrats found dead in their own baths, killed by the very luxury they thought would preserve their health and status. The most famous case was that of a senator who ordered his private bath heated to what he considered the perfect temperature for a winter evening. The slaves, eager to please and terrified of disappointing their master, stoked the hypocaust furnace until the bath chamber reached temperatures approaching 120 degrees Fahrenheit. When they went to summon him for his evening meal, they found him unconscious on the marble floor. His skin burned red as a lobster's shell. He lingered for 3 days, his body unable to regulate its temperature, before finally succumbing to heat stroke in his own bedchamber. As evening approached and oil lamps began to flicker throughout the complex like earthbound stars, casting their uncertain light on scenes of human endurance and folly, you might finally understand why Romans often spent entire days at the baths. It was not necessarily because they enjoyed the experience, though many claimed to, but because the process was so lengthy and involved that it could not be rushed without defeating its purpose. The Roman approach to bathing was methodical, almost ritualistic, requiring patience and endurance that modern life has not prepared you for. First came the gradual warming in the tepidarium, with the body slowly adjusted to the higher temperatures that awaited. This process alone could take an hour or more, as the Romans believed that sudden temperature changes were harmful to health. Men would sit or recline on the warm marble benches, allowing their bodies to acclimate while engaging in the social conversations that were as much a part of the bathing process as the physical cleansing. Rushing this stage was considered not only unhealthy, but socially inappropriate, a sign that you valued efficiency over the civilized pleasures of human company. Then came the intense heat of the caldarium, where temperatures that would hospitalize modern bathers were endured with stoic determination. This was not a quick dip, but a prolonged soaking, often lasting an hour or more, while the heat penetrated deep into the muscles and supposedly drew out the impurities that caused disease. The Romans believed that sweating was essential to health, that the body needed to purge itself of accumulated toxins through the pores. They would remain in these brutally hot chambers until their skin turned red and their vision began to blur, pushing the limits of human endurance in pursuit of health and cleanliness. Following the caldarium came the shock of the frigidarium's cold pools, where ice-cold water provided relief from the heat, but created its own form of torment. The sudden temperature change was believed to strengthen the body's constitution, to harden it against disease and weakness. Men would plunge into water so cold it stopped their breath and made their hearts race, remaining submerged until their skin turned blue and their muscles began to cramp. This thermal shock therapy, while popular, undoubtedly killed some bathers whose hearts could not handle the extreme temperature fluctuations. Then came the scraping and oiling, the methodical removal of dead skin and accumulated grime through the application of the bronze strigil. This process required both time and tolerance for discomfort, as the scraping was thorough enough to remove not just dirt, but often healthy skin as well. The oils used for this process were expensive and considered essential to proper hygiene, but they also created a breeding ground for bacteria and provided a medium for the transmission of various skin conditions from one bather to another. Perhaps there would be a massage or other treatment performed by slaves whose knowledge of anatomy was practical rather than scientific. These massages could be pleasant, but they could also be dangerous, as the practitioners had no understanding of circulatory systems or pressure points. Overzealous massage could result in internal injuries, while the oils and ointments used often contained substances that would be considered toxic by modern standards. Mercury-based preparations were popular for treating skin conditions, while lead-based cosmetics were applied to improve complexion, gradually poisoning those who used them regularly. Each step required time, patience, and a tolerance for discomfort that modern life has not prepared you for. But it also required a social stamina that might prove even more challenging. The conversations, negotiations, and social maneuvering that accompanied every aspect of the bathing process demanded constant attention and energy. You could not simply zone out and endure the physical discomfort. You had to remain socially engaged, mentally alert, and culturally appropriate throughout an ordeal that might last from noon until sunset. The journey home through Rome's streets would offer little relief from the assault on your senses. The same lack of hygiene that made the baths necessary also made the city itself a challenge to your modern sensibilities. Open sewers carried waste through channels that ran alongside major thoroughfares, their contents mixing with rainwater to create a foul-smelling soup that splashed onto passers-by during storms. Animal waste from the thousands of horses, mules, and oxen that moved goods through the city accumulated in the streets, creating a layer of muck that coated everything with a patina of filth. Rotting garbage piled in corners where it attracted rats, insects, and scavenging dogs that competed with the poorest citizens for scraps of food. The press of unwashed humanity slaves, freedmen, citizens, and foreigners all crowded together in streets designed for a much smaller population created a human miasma that followed you like a cloud. The smell alone would be overwhelming, but combined with the heat, noise, and chaos of urban life, it would create sensory overload that might leave you longing for the relative peace of the bathhouse. The buildings that lined the streets rose 7 or 8 stories into the smoky air, their upper floors housing the poorest residents in conditions that would horrify modern housing inspectors. These insulae, as they were called, were constructed with minimal regard for safety or sanitation. Fire was a constant threat, as cooking fires and oil lamps provided the only sources of heat and light. Collapse was equally common, as builders used cheap materials and cut corners to maximize profits. The streets below were regularly showered with debris human waste emptied from chamber pots, broken pottery, food scraps, and occasionally the bodies of those who had fallen or been pushed from upper windows. Yet somehow, the clean, private shower awaiting you in your modern world would seem like paradise itself after a day spent navigating the challenges of Roman hygiene. The unlimited supply of hot water, heated to precise temperatures and delivered through pipes that had been sanitized and maintained according to strict health codes, would feel like a miracle of engineering and civilization. The privacy, the cleanliness, the simple luxury of being able to control every aspect of your bathing experience would make you appreciate modern conveniences in ways you had never imagined possible. This was the reality of Roman bathing, not the serene, marble-columned retreat of popular imagination, but a hot, crowded, unsanitary, and often dangerous social institution that tested the limits of human endurance while serving as the beating heart of Roman social life. That it remained popular for centuries, spreading throughout the empire and inspiring imitation in lands as distant as Britain and Morocco speaks not to its comfort, but to its necessity in a world where private bathing was a luxury few could afford, and social isolation was a fate worse than physical discomfort. The rhythm of their lives moved to different drum beats than ours, shaped by different expectations and different tolerances for discomfort, different understanding of health and hygiene, different concepts of privacy and social interaction. What seems unbearable to us was simply Tuesday afternoon to them, as natural and necessary as any other aspect of civilized life. They endured what we would consider torture because they knew no alternative, and they found joy and meaning in experiences that would send us fleeing in horror because their world had taught them to value community over comfort, social connection over individual convenience, and the shared struggle of human existence over the isolated pleasures of modern life. From the steamy chaos of the public baths, let us step into a world of marble corridors and whispered conversations where power moved like shadows across polished floors, and a single misjudged word could mean the difference between fortune and ruin. Here in the rarefied air of imperial Rome lived Lucius Annaeus Seneca, philosopher-playwright, and one of the wealthiest men in the empire, dancing the most dangerous dance of all, serving as advisor to a god who happened to be a 17-year-old boy named Nero. Picture Seneca in the year 54 AD, already in his 50s, his hair silver white against the purple-striped toga of his senatorial rank. His hands, soft from years of wielding a stylus rather than a sword, nevertheless bore the weight of enormous responsibility. The young Emperor Nero, barely past boyhood, looked to this aging Stoic for guidance in ruling an empire that stretched from Britain to the Euphrates. It was a position that would have tested the wisdom of Solomon and the patience of Job. The path that led Seneca to this precarious pinnacle of power began decades earlier in the dusty hills of Hispania Baetica, in the city of Corduba, modern-day Cordoba. Born around 04 BC to a family of ambitious provincials, Seneca was the middle son of Marcus Annaeus Seneca the Elder, a renowned teacher of rhetoric whose fame had spread even to Rome itself. The elder Seneca was a man who understood the mechanics of words, how they could be shaped and polished, and wielded like weapons in the courts and assemblies of the Republic. But it was his son who would discover that words, no matter how skillfully deployed, sometimes proved inadequate against the raw force of imperial will. Young Lucius showed early promise in the family trade. His father recognized in him not just the quick wit necessary for rhetorical success, but something deeper, a hunger for understanding that went beyond mere verbal cleverness. When the family moved to Rome during Lucius's youth, they brought with them the provincial's mixture of ambition and insecurity, the desperate need to prove themselves worthy of the capital's attention. Rome in those days was a city transforming itself from republic to empire, though few yet understood the full implications of that transformation. Augustus had brought peace after decades of civil war, but the price of that peace was the gradual erosion of the institutions that had made Rome great. The Senate still met, still debated, still passed resolutions, but everyone understood that real power now resided in the Palatine Hill, in the growing complex of palaces where the Caesars held court. For a young man of Seneca's background and talents, the path forward seemed clear. Master the art of rhetoric, gain admission to the Senate, climb the cursus honorum step by careful step, and perhaps, if fortune smiled, achieve the consulship that represented the pinnacle of Roman political achievement. But Seneca's mind was drawn to questions that mere political success could not answer. What was the good life? How should a man conduct himself in an imperfect world? What duties did he owe to his family, his friends, his state, and himself? These questions led him to the writings of the Stoic philosophers, particularly Epictetus and Chrysippus, whose teachings offered a framework for understanding virtue and vice, duty and desire, reason and passion. Stoicism taught that the universe was governed by divine reason, that everything happened according to fate, and that wisdom lay in accepting what could not be changed, while working diligently to influence what could be. For a young man navigating the treacherous waters of imperial politics, such teachings offered both comfort and guidance. But Seneca's early career nearly ended before it began. In 41 AD, during the reign of Claudius, he found himself accused of adultery with Julia Livilla, the sister of the late Emperor Caligula. The charges were almost certainly political. Julia Livilla was suspected of plotting against Claudius, and Seneca's rhetorical skills made him a valuable ally for any potential conspirator. Whether he was guilty of the adultery charge remains unknown, but the penalty was exile to the barren island of Corsica. For 8 years, Seneca lived on that rocky outcrop in the Mediterranean, cut off from the literary salons and political intrigues of Rome. It was a period of profound hardship that tested every principle of Stoic philosophy he had embraced. The man who had written eloquently about accepting fate with equanimity found himself railing against the injustice of his situation, composing bitter letters to influential friends, begging for their intercession. The irony was not lost on him. Here he was, a professional philosopher, unable to practice what he preached when faced with genuine adversity. His letters from this period reveal a man struggling with the gap between intellectual understanding and emotional reality. He wrote of longing for Rome's theaters and libraries, of missing the conversations that had nourished his mind, of feeling his talents wither in isolation. Yet exile also provided opportunities for reflection and writing that the busy life of a Roman senator would never have allowed. During his years on Corsica, Seneca composed several of his most important philosophical works, including treatises on anger, on the happy life, and on the brevity of existence. These writings showed a deepening understanding of human nature, informed by his own struggles with disappointment and despair. The turning point came in 49 AD, when Agrippina the Younger, Claudius's new wife, arranged for Seneca's recall from exile. Agrippina had her own reasons for wanting the philosopher in Rome. She was already planning for her son Nero, as eventual succession to the throne, and she needed tutors who could prepare the boy for the responsibilities of power. Seneca's reputation as both a philosopher and a skilled orator made him an ideal choice. The arrangement suited everyone involved. Claudius gained credit for his clemency in recalling a distinguished exile. Agrippina secured a capable tutor for her ambitious son, and Seneca, after 8 years of enforced isolation, returned to the center of Roman political life with a gratitude that bordered on servility. His letters to Polybius, one of Claudius's freedmen, are painful to read in their obsequious flattery, as the proud Stoic philosopher groveled before men he would once have considered his social inferiors. When Seneca first met the young Nero around 50 AD, he encountered a boy of unusual promise. Nero was intelligent, quick-witted, and possessed of genuine artistic sensibilities that set him apart from the typical products of Roman aristocratic education. He could compose verses with facility, showed real talent for music and drama, and seemed genuinely interested in the philosophical discussions that formed part of his education. For a few brief years, it seemed possible that Stoic philosophy might indeed produce the ideal ruler that Marcus Aurelius would later become. Seneca threw himself into his tutorial duties with enthusiasm, composing treatises specifically for his imperial pupil and crafting lessons that would prepare Nero for the responsibilities of power. He taught the young prince about justice and mercy, about the duties of a ruler to his subjects, about the importance of self-control and rational decision-making. But even during these hopeful years, there were warning signs that a more experienced observer might have recognized. Nero's artistic interests often took precedence over his political education. His attention span was limited, and he showed a disturbing tendency to become bored with discussions of administrative detail or legal precedent. Most troubling of all, he seemed to view his future power less as a responsibility than as an opportunity for self-expression. When Claudius died in 54 AD poisoned, many whispered, by his wife Agrippina, Nero ascended to the throne at the age of 16. For the first time in Roman history, a Stoic philosopher found himself with direct access to unlimited power. It was an opportunity that earlier generations of philosophers could only have dreamed of. The chance to put theoretical principles into practical action on the grandest possible stage. Imagine yourself walking beside Seneca through the corridors of the Domus Transitoria, Nero's palace, in those early days of the reign. The floors beneath your feet are intricate mosaics depicting scenes of Roman triumph, each tiny stone placed by craftsmen whose names history has forgotten. The walls rise around you, covered in frescoes of impossible beauty, gardens that bloom eternal, birds that will never age, gods frozen in moments of divine perfection. The palace itself was a marvel of engineering and artistry, incorporating innovations from across the empire. Water flowed through hidden channels to create cooling fountains in the summer heat. Rooms could be opened to the sky through ingenious systems of movable panels. The gardens contained plants from Britain and Egypt, from Germania and Gaul, a living demonstration of Roman dominion over the natural world. But despite the beauty surrounding him, Seneca moved through these halls with the careful steps of a man walking on ice. Every conversation was a negotiation, every silence a statement, every gesture observed and interpreted by dozens of eyes that reported back to other ears, other minds that calculated advantage and disadvantage with the precision of moneylenders. The imperial court was an ecosystem of competing ambitions, where senators jockeyed for access to the emperor, where freedmen wielded influence that exceeded their legal status, or wives and mothers and mistresses, shaped policy through pillow talk and whispered suggestions. Seneca had to navigate this world while maintaining his philosophical principles, serving his imperial master, and protecting his own position. A triangulation that would have challenged the most skilled diplomat. The irony of Seneca's position would not have been lost on him. Here was a man who had spent decades writing about the virtue of poverty, the dangers of wealth, and the importance of living according to nature. Yet he had accumulated a fortune estimated at 300 million sestertii, enough to buy entire provinces. His wealth came from various sources: rewards from grateful emperors, returns on investments in British mines, interest from loans made to provincial governors desperate for capital. The same philosophical mind that preached detachment from material possessions had proven remarkably adept at accumulating them. But perhaps this contradiction was less hypocritical than it appeared. In the Roman world, influence required wealth, and wealth required the careful cultivation of profitable relationships. A philosopher without money was merely a curiosity, a figure of mild interest in the salons of the wealthy, but utterly without power to influence policy or protect the vulnerable. Seneca's fortune was his insurance policy, his guarantee that his voice would be heard when it mattered most. Consider the weight of his daily routine during those early years of Nero's reign. Each morning, Seneca would rise before dawn in his villa on the Palatine Hill, the most exclusive address in Rome. The location itself was a statement of his status. Only the emperor's closest associates were permitted to build homes so close to the imperial palaces. From his windows, he could see the Forum Romanum spread out below, the heart of the city where Roman law and Roman justice were supposedly administered. His slaves, and he owned hundreds, would already be preparing his correspondence, sorting through requests from across the empire. Senators seeking favor, governors requesting guidance, poets hoping for patronage, philosophers desiring recognition. Each letter represented a thread in the vast web of obligation and influence that held the empire together. A word from Seneca could advance a career or destroy it, could open doors or slam them shut, could mean the difference between prosperity and poverty for ambitious men across the Mediterranean world. His breakfast would be simple, in keeping with his Stoic principles, perhaps bread, honey, and watered wine. But the bread was the finest available, baked from grain grown on his own estates in Sicily. The honey was collected from his own apiaries, tended by slaves who had been trained in the ancient arts of beekeeping. The wine was aged in amphorae worth more than most Romans earned in a year, stored in cellars that maintained the perfect temperature and humidity for preserving the vintage. Even his simplicity was expensive, a luxury available only to those wealthy enough to choose poverty as a philosophical exercise, rather than endure it as a daily reality. The distinction mattered enormously in Roman society, where voluntary simplicity was seen as a mark of virtue, while involuntary. Poverty was viewed as a sign of moral failure or divine disfavor. The morning audience with Nero required careful preparation. Seneca would review intelligence reports from across the empire, written in the terse, coded language that imperial administrators had perfected over decades of practice. Grain shortages in Egypt that could lead to riots in Rome if not addressed quickly. Unrest among the Germanic tribes that might require military intervention. A fire in Alexandria that had destroyed several warehouses, threatening the supply of papyrus that kept the imperial bureaucracy functioning. Each piece of information had to be presented to the emperor in a way that informed without alarming, educated without condescending, guided without appearing to manipulate. Nero was sensitive to any suggestion that others were trying to control him, a sensitivity that would only increase as his reign progressed and his paranoia deepened. But Nero was not the teachable young Marcus Aurelius that Stoic philosophy might have preferred. He was mercurial, brilliant in some ways, but utterly lacking in self-control. His passions ruled him completely: his love for music and theater, his fascination with chariot racing, his growing interest in the more exotic pleasures that unlimited power could provide. Seneca found himself trying to channel a force of nature, to provide wisdom to someone who increasingly saw wisdom as weakness and restraint as cowardice. The young emperor's education had been comprehensive, but oddly unbalanced. He could recite Homer from memory, compose verses in both Latin and Greek, and discuss the finer points of rhetorical theory with genuine insight. But he had no real understanding of administration, no patience for the tedious details of governance, and no appreciation for the delicate balance of interests that kept the empire functioning. This gap in his education would have consequences that extended far beyond the palace walls. An empire that stretched from Hadrianus Wall to the cataracts of the Nile required constant attention to detail, careful management of resources, and the ability to distinguish between urgent problems and minor irritations. Nero's impatience with such matters meant that real power gradually devolved to his advisors, creating a situation where the emperor reigned but did not rule. Picture one of their morning conferences, perhaps in the year 58 AD. Nero, now 21, paces around the room like a caged leopard, his toga askew, his hair disheveled from running his fingers through it, a nervous habit that had become more pronounced as the pressures of rule mounted. The room itself reflects his personality. Traditional Roman furniture mixed with exotic imports from the East, busts of ancient philosophers sharing space with masks from the theater, scrolls of state documents scattered among drafts of his own poetry. Seneca sits carefully upright in a chair of ivory and gold, his hands folded in his lap, his face composed in the expression of patient attention he had perfected over years of dealing with imperial temperaments. He has learned to read Nero's moods with the skill of a sailor reading the wind, adjusting his approach accordingly. When the emperor is energetic, Seneca can present complex issues and expect serious consideration. When Nero is distracted or irritable, it is better to focus on simple matters that can be resolved quickly. The people grow restless, Nero might say, his voice carrying the petulant edge that increasingly crept into his pronouncements. They whisper about the games, about the cost of grain, about my mother's influence. They forget that I am their emperor, chosen by the gods, blessed by divine favor. The complaint reveals much about Nero's state of mind. He was beginning to confuse the forms of power with its substance, to mistake the ceremonies of rule for genuine authority. The Roman people, as grumbling about bread prices, was not really about bread. It was about their sense that the emperor was losing touch with their daily concerns, that he was more interested in artistic pursuits than in practical governance. Seneca would measure his response carefully, knowing that agreement might encourage Nero's worst instincts, while disagreement might be seen as disloyalty. The people's concerns are natural, Caesar. They worry about their daily bread, their children's futures. When we address their needs, their loyalty follows naturally. It was a diplomatic answer that acknowledged the emperor's frustration, while gently redirecting his attention toward constructive action. But increasingly, Nero was less interested in addressing needs than in silencing complaints. The young emperor had inherited not just power but paranoia, the constant fear that someone somewhere was plotting his downfall. And in imperial Rome, such fears were not entirely unfounded. The history of the Julio-Claudian dynasty was written in blood adoptions and assassinations, marriages and murders, each succession bringing new opportunities for ambitious men to advance their fortunes or end their lives. Augustus had died peacefully in his bed, but his successors had been less fortunate. Caligula had been murdered by his own guards. Claudius had been poisoned by his wife. The precedents were not encouraging for a young emperor who was beginning to show signs of the same instability that had destroyed his predecessors. Seneca watched with growing unease as Nero's circle of advisors began to include men whose qualifications owed more to their willingness to flatter than their ability to govern. Auphonius Tigellinus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, whispered constantly in Nero's ear about threats that required harsh responses. A former horse trainer who had risen through the ranks by virtue of his ruthlessness rather than his wisdom, Tigellinus understood that his position depended on keeping the emperor frightened and dependent. Poppaea Sabina, Nero's mistress and later his wife, encouraged his artistic pretensions while feeding his suspicions about potential rivals. Beautiful, intelligent, and utterly without scruples, Poppaea had already disposed of one husband to make herself available to the emperor. She understood instinctively how to manipulate Nero's vanity and insecurity, praising his poetry while poisoning his mind against anyone who might offer contrary advice. The philosopher found himself increasingly isolated. His counsel sought less frequently, his warnings dismissed as the overcautious mutterings of an old man who had forgotten what it meant to be young and powerful. Yet he could not simply withdraw from court life, for withdrawal itself might be interpreted as disapproval, and disapproval of the emperor was treason. This was the fundamental trap of imperial service. Proximity to power was dangerous, but distance from power was equally perilous. Seneca had to remain close enough to influence events when possible, but not so close that he became identified with policies he could not control. It was a balance that required constant adjustment, like a sailor trimming his sails to catch the wind without being overwhelmed by it. The early years of Nero's reign were marked by what historians would later call the Quinquennium Neronis, 5 years of relatively good government, during which the empire prospered under the guidance of Seneca and Boris, the Praetorian prefect. Together, they managed to channel Nero's energies toward constructive ends, overseeing reforms in taxation, improvements in the legal system, and a generally peaceful foreign policy. But beneath the surface stability, tensions were building that would eventually tear the regime apart. Nero's relationship with his mother Agrippina had become increasingly strained as the young emperor chafed under her attempts to control his behavior. Agrippina had engineered her son's rise to power, but she expected to continue wielding influence through him. Nero, surrounded by flatterers who assured him of his divine nature and unlimited authority, grew to resent his mother's interference. The year 59 had brought the crisis that would define the remainder of Seneca's life and ultimately seal his fate. Nero, driven by a complex mixture of fear, resentment, and genuine hatred, decided that his mother, Agrippina the Younger, had to die. Agrippina had been instrumental in securing Nero's adoption by Claudius and his subsequent elevation to the purple, but her continued meddling in imperial affairs had become unbearable to her son. The decision to murder his mother was not made lightly, even by someone as impulsive as Nero. Matricide was considered one of the most heinous crimes in Roman culture, a violation of the natural order that would damn the perpetrator in this world and the next. But Agrippina's political maneuvering had convinced Nero that she represented an existential threat to his rule, and fear proved stronger than filial duty. The murder itself was a masterpiece of elaborate planning and bungled execution that perfectly captured the contradiction between Nero's grandiose ambitions and his practical incompetence. Unable to simply order his mother's execution, such an act would have shocked even the hardened courtiers of Imperial. Rome Nero commissioned a collapsible boat designed to sink in the Bay of Naples, drowning Agrippina as if by accident. The plan required considerable technical expertise and careful coordination. Naval architects had to design a vessel that would appear seaworthy, but could be made to disintegrate on command. The timing had to be perfect, the location carefully chosen to ensure that no rescue would be possible. Even the guest list for the fatal boat trip had to be managed to ensure that the right witnesses would survive to tell the approved version of events. But the boat failed to sink completely, and Agrippina, showing the same iron will that had carried her through decades of imperial intrigue, swam to shore. The woman who had survived the reigns of Tiberius Caligula, and Claudius was not going to be defeated by her own son's amateur attempts at assassination. When she reached land, wet and furious, she immediately began making plans to strike back at Nero. Nero, panicked by the failure of his elaborate scheme, sent soldiers to finish the work with swords. The murder was carried out with brutal efficiency in Agrippina's villa, but the political consequences were immediate and devastating. News of the matricide spread quickly through Rome, creating a scandal that would haunt Nero for the rest of his reign. Seneca's role in this affair remains one of history's most troubling questions. Ancient sources suggest that he helped compose the letter Nero sent to the Senate explaining his mother's death, painting her as a would-be assassin whose own plot had failed. The letter was a masterpiece of rhetorical manipulation, twisting the facts to portray Nero as the innocent victim of his mother's ambition. Whether Seneca acted from genuine belief in Agrippina's guilt, from fear for his own safety, or from a calculated decision that cooperation was preferable to martyrdom, we will never know. What we do know is that his involvement in the cover-up represented a moral compromise that would have consequences far beyond the immediate political crisis. The Stoic philosopher, who had written eloquently about the importance of virtue and the supremacy of moral law, found himself complicit in murder and fraud. He had become what he had always warned others against, a man who sacrificed his principles for the sake of political expediency. The irony was bitter and inescapable. What we do know is that the weight of compromise began to show in Seneca's private writings from this period. His letters to his friend Lucilius take on a darker tone, dwelling more frequently on themes of mortality, the corruption of power, and the difficulty of maintaining virtue in an imperfect world. The confident Stoic moralist of his earlier works gives way to a more complex figure, a man grappling with the gap between philosophical ideals and political realities. The correspondence with Lucilius, which would eventually become one of Seneca's most enduring literary achievements, was begun during this period of crisis and self-doubt. Lucilius was a fellow Roman who had chosen to withdraw from public life, living quietly in Sicily and devoting himself to philosophical study. For Seneca, trapped in the web of imperial politics, Lucilius represented the path not taken, the possibility of a life lived according to principle rather than expediency. In his letters to his friend, Seneca explored questions that he could not address openly in his public writings. How should a wise man conduct himself when surrounded by corruption? Was it better to remain engaged with an imperfect world, or to withdraw into philosophical contemplation? Could virtue survive compromise, or was moral purity possible only in isolation? Imagine Seneca in his study during these later years. Perhaps around 62 AD, Rome is lined with scrolls, his own works on ethics and natural philosophy, the writings of earlier Stoics like Chrysippus and Epictetus, copies of Greek tragedies that had influenced his own dramatic works. The collection represents a lifetime of learning, but also serves as a reproach to the choices he has made. The gap between knowledge and action had never seemed so wide. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere conducive to reflection but haunted by regret. The light wavers constantly, a metaphor for the uncertainty that had come to characterize his life. Even in his private study, surrounded by the wisdom of ages, Seneca could not escape the knowledge that he had failed to live up to his own teachings. He writes by lamplight, his stylus moving across wax tablets with the practiced ease of someone who has spent a lifetime shaping words. But the words themselves reveal a man under enormous strain. Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end. He writes in one of his letters, perhaps thinking of his own moral death and potential rebirth. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. He observes in another, trying to convince himself as much as his correspondent that the psychological burden of compromise need not be unbearable. The accumulation of compromises was taking its toll in ways that went beyond mere guilt or regret. Seneca had rationalized his vast wealth as necessary for maintaining influence, his political alliances as essential for promoting Stoic values, his silence about Nero's excesses as strategically wise. But each rationalization required the next, each compromise demanded another, until the gap between his philosophical teachings and his lived reality had become a chasm that no amount of clever reasoning could bridge. The process was insidious, like a slow poison that gradually weakened the victim's resistance. Each moral compromise made the next one easier to justify. Each act of complicity reduced the psychological barriers to further collaboration. Seneca found himself trapped in a web of his own making, unable to extricate himself without admitting the futility of everything he had tried to accomplish. By 62 AD, the situation had become unbearable. Nero's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic, his suspicions more pronounced, his cruelty more arbitrary. The emperor, who had once listened respectfully to philosophical discourse, now surrounded himself with flatterers and informers, men who understood that their fortunes depended on feeding his paranoia and encouraging his worst impulses. Seneca was actively seeking to withdraw from public life, but the process required careful negotiation. Simply disappearing from court would be interpreted as disapproval, or worse, preparation for opposition. He needed to find a way to disengage gradually, to reduce his visibility, without appearing to criticize the emperor's policies or abandon his responsibilities. He approached Nero with a carefully prepared speech, offering to return much of his wealth to the imperial treasury and retire to private study. It was a masterpiece of diplomatic language, framing his desire to leave as concern for the emperor's reputation rather than distaste for his policies. The speech acknowledged Nero's generosity, while suggesting that continued association with his former tutor might somehow diminish the emperor as glory. "I have held positions of honor for long enough," he told Nero, according to Tacitus's account. "You have conferred on me immense wealth. I am satisfied. You have surrounded me with such influence that I can want nothing more except the self-control to use these gifts wisely." The words were chosen with exquisite care. By emphasizing his satisfaction with what he had received, Seneca hoped to avoid any suggestion of ingratitude. By speaking of self-control, he invoked the stoic virtue that Nero had been taught to respect. By offering to return his wealth, he demonstrated that his desire for retirement was not motivated by greed or ambition. But Nero was not ready to let his former tutor depart. The emperor had grown suspicious of everyone around him, and Seneca's withdrawal might be interpreted as criticism or worse, preparation for opposition. With honeyed words and veiled threats, Nero convinced Seneca to remain at court, but their relationship had fundamentally changed. The teacher had become a potential threat, the advisor a possible rival. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. From that moment forward, Seneca was no longer a trusted counselor, but a watched man, someone whose every action was scrutinized for signs of disloyalty. The emperor, who had once sought his guidance, now saw him as a reminder of his own moral failures, a living reproach to the path his reign had taken. The next 3 years passed like a slow-burning fuse approaching powder. Seneca remained nominally in Nero's inner circle, but his influence waned as the emperor surrounded himself with flatterers and yes-men. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, which destroyed much of the city and led to the infamous persecution of Christians, found Seneca largely sidelined, watching helplessly as Nero's reign descended into increasing cruelty and paranoia. The fire itself was a disaster of unprecedented proportions, consuming entire neighborhoods and leaving hundreds of thousands of Romans homeless. Nero's response revealed both his administrative incompetence and his growing detachment from reality. While the city burned, the emperor was said to have composed poetry about the destruction of Troy, as if the real suffering of his subjects was merely material for artistic expression. The subsequent persecution of Christians was driven partly by the need to find scapegoats for the disaster, and partly by Nero's desire to provide spectacular entertainment for the Roman mob. The crucifixions and burnings that followed were horrific, even by the standards of imperial Rome, representing a new level of cruelty that shocked contemporary observers. Through it all, Seneca watched from the sidelines, his philosophical principles and political influence alike proving inadequate to prevent the atrocities being committed in the name of Roman order. The man who had once hoped to guide the empire toward virtue and wisdom found himself a helpless witness to its descent into madness. The end, when it came in 65 AD, arrived with the swift inevitability of a sword thrust. The Pisonian conspiracy, a plot by senators and other nobles to assassinate Nero and replace him with Gaius Calpurnius Piso, was discovered before it could be executed. Under torture, some of the conspirators named Seneca as a participant, though whether from genuine knowledge or desperate hope of implicating others remains unclear. The conspiracy itself was a desperate measure by men who had concluded that Nero's reign had become unbearable. The participants included senators, knights, even members of the Praetorian Guard who were supposed to protect the emperor. Their plan was to kill Nero during the races at the Circus Maximus and proclaim Piso as his successor. But conspiracies in imperial Rome rarely remained secret for long. Informers were everywhere, and the rewards for betraying plotters were substantial. When the plan was discovered, Nero's response was swift and merciless. Dozens of prominent Romans were arrested, tortured, and executed. The emperor, who had once been taught about mercy by his Stoic tutor, showed none to those who had plotted against him. Picture the scene when Nero's messenger arrived at Seneca's villa with the emperor's final command. The sun was setting over the 7 hills of Rome, casting long shadows across the gardens where Seneca had spent so many hours in contemplation. The messenger, a centurion of the Praetorian Guard, delivered his orders with the mechanical precision of a soldier who had performed this duty too many times before. Seneca was to take his own life. The villa itself was a monument to the contradictions of Seneca's life. Its gardens contained rare plants from across the empire. Its library held thousands of scrolls. Its halls were decorated with works of art that represented the highest achievements of human creativity. Yet it was also a prison, a place where a man waited for death at the pleasure of a tyrant. The manner of his death became, in many ways, the defining moment of his life. Faced with the emperor's command, Seneca chose to meet his end as a Stoic philosopher should, with calm acceptance and dignity intact. He gathered his household around him, spoke briefly about the principles that had guided his life, and opened his veins with a blade. But even in death, fate seemed determined to test his resolve. Old age and years of comfortable living had left his circulation poor, and the blood flowed slowly from his wounds. He tried additional cuts, drank hemlock in the manner of Socrates, and finally had to be carried to a heated bath where the warm water would speed the process. His wife Pompeia Paulina attempted to die with him, opening her own veins in a gesture of devotion that recalled the legendary marriages of Roman antiquity. But Nero ordered her wounds bound and her life preserved, perhaps as a final cruelty to his former teacher, perhaps as a demonstration that even in death, the emperor's will was supreme. Seneca's last hours were spent dictating to his secretaries, creating one final work that has not survived to modern times. We can only imagine what wisdom he might have shared in those final moments. Reflections on a life spent trying to reconcile philosophical ideals with political realities. Observations on the nature of power and its corrupting influence, perhaps some final attempt to make sense of the compromises that had defined his later years. The irony of his death would not have escaped him. Here was a man who had written extensively about the importance of accepting fate with equanimity, yet he was dying because he had spent decades trying to shape that fate through political involvement. The Stoic who preached detachment from worldly concerns was meeting his end because he had become too attached to worldly power. Yet perhaps there was a kind of justice in it as well. Seneca had lived through one of the most turbulent periods in Roman history, had wielded enormous influence during the early years of an emperor who would be remembered as one of history's greatest monsters, and had accumulated wealth beyond the dreams of most Romans. If the price of that life was a forced suicide at the emperor's command, it was a price that many of his contemporaries had already paid. In the gathering darkness of that Roman evening, as Seneca's life ebbed away in the heated bath, the distance between philosophical ideals and political realities finally closed. The teacher who had tried to guide an empire through the wisdom of Stoicism became himself a lesson in the limits of philosophy when confronted with unlimited power. His death marked the end of an era, the last gasp of the hope that reason and virtue might somehow tame the beast of imperial autocracy. After Seneca, no philosopher would wield such influence in the corridors of Roman power. The lesson was clear. To serve Caesar was to risk becoming Caesar's victim, and no amount of wisdom could change that fundamental truth. The rhythm of his life had moved from promise to compromise to tragedy, each phase flowing inexorably into the next like water running downhill toward the sea. In the end, the man who had written so eloquently about the importance of living according to nature discovered that human nature itself might be the greatest obstacle to the virtuous life he had spent a lifetime trying to define. From the marble halls where philosophers met their fate, let us descend into the shadows, literally and figuratively, into the hidden world that existed beneath the streets of imperial Rome. Here, in chambers carved from living rock, accessible only through narrow passages that forced men to crawl on hands and knees, another kind of drama unfolded. Here, Roman soldiers, merchants, and civil servants gathered in secret to worship a god whose very name was whispered rather than proclaimed, whose mysteries were guarded more carefully than state secrets. The Rome of the 2nd century A.D. was a city of layers, both literal and metaphorical. Above ground, the gleaming marble facades of temples and basilicas proclaimed the glory of empire and the favor of the traditional gods. Below ground, in the network of tunnels, sewers, and forgotten foundations that honeycombed the earth beneath the city, older powers stirred. It was as if the very soil of Rome had become sacred through the accumulation of centuries, and those who sought the deepest truths understood that they must descend to find them. Imagine yourself, if you can, following a Roman centurion through the twisting streets of Rome on a moonless night in the 2nd century. Add, the city above sleeps fitfully disturbed by the usual sounds of urban life, the rumble of carts delivering goods the distant, shouts of the vigils on their rounds, the occasional cry of a night bird, or the scurrying of rats to the garbage that accumulated in every alley. The insulae towered overhead like cliffs, their upper stories swaying slightly in the night breeze, their windows dark except for the occasional flicker of an oil lamp where someone worked late or tended a sick child. Your guide moves with the confident stride of someone who has walked these paths many times before. His hobnailed boots echo softly on the stone pavement as he leads you away from the main thoroughfares, through increasingly narrow passages between towering insulae, those multi-story apartment buildings that housed Rome's teeming masses. The air grows cooler as you descend, following streets that seem to burrow deeper into the earth with each turn. Here the grand architecture of the Forum and the Palatine gives way to something older, more functional walls of tufa stone, darkened with age archways that might have been built when the Republic was. Young foundations that spoke of Rome's humbler origins. The centurion's weathered face gives away nothing of his thoughts, but you can sense his anticipation. This is not merely a journey through the city's back streets. It is a pilgrimage, a return to a sacred space that has shaped his understanding of the world and his place in it. The bronze decorations on his armor catch what little moonlight filters down between the buildings. And you notice that among the standard military insignia, there are symbols that seem out of place. A raven, a burning torch, a dagger pointed downward. Finally, he stops before what appears to be nothing more than a wall of dressed stone, part of some ancient foundation. But his hands find a hidden mechanism, and a section of the wall swings inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a passage so narrow that you must turn sideways to squeeze through. The smell that emerges is distinctive, not unpleasant, but strange. Incense, certainly, but also something else. The scent of stone that has never seen sunlight. of air that has circulated through underground chambers for decades, of torch smoke and melted wax and something indefinably sacred. The transition from the world above to the world below is immediate and profound. The moment you step through that hidden doorway, you leave behind not just the physical realm of Rome, but the entire framework of assumptions that governed life in the empire. Above ground, a man's worth was measured by his birth, his wealth, his political connections, his military achievements. Below ground, in the realm of Mithras, different rules applied older rules, rules that reached back to the mountains of Persia and forward to the end of time itself. The passage slopes downward, carved roughly from the living rock beneath Rome. Your fingers trail along walls that bear the marks of iron tools, and occasionally you feel carved symbols, crude reliefs that your eyes cannot make out in the darkness, but that your fingertips recognize as deliberate, meaningful. The centurion ahead of you carries no torch. This is a path he could walk blindfolded, and indeed, the darkness seems to be part of the experience. Each step takes you deeper into the earth, deeper into mystery, deeper into a realm where the ordinary laws of cause and effect give way to something more primal and more true. The walls themselves tell a story for those who know how to read it. The tool marks are not random. They follow patterns that echo the sacred geometry of the Mithraic mysteries. The carved symbols are not mere decoration, but waymarks on a spiritual journey, reminders of the stages of initiation that every devotee must pass through. Even the roughness of the stone serves a purpose, for it speaks of the difficulty of the path, the struggle required to achieve enlightenment. As you descend, the weight of the city above presses down on your consciousness. Somewhere over your head, perhaps 50 feet of earth and stone, and the detritus of centuries separates you from the world of daylight. This is not simply a basement or a cellar. This is a deliberate journey into the underworld, a symbolic death and rebirth that begins the moment you step through that hidden door. The air grows thicker, warmer, charged with an energy that seems to pulse with the rhythm of your heartbeat. The passage opens suddenly into a chamber that takes your breath away, not for its size. It is actually quite small, perhaps 30 feet long and half as wide, but for its intensity. The walls are covered in frescoes that seem to writhe and dance in the flickering light of oil lamps. The colors are rich in deep gold and red and midnight blue, applied with a skill that would not be out of place in the finest Roman villas. But these are not mere decorations. They are windows into another reality, glimpses of cosmic truths that can only be perceived by those who have prepared themselves through ritual and sacrifice. A central image dominates the far wall. A young man in Persian dress, his knee pressed into the back of a white bull, his left hand gripping its nostrils, his right hand driving a dagger deep into its neck. Blood flows from the wound, but instead of pooling on the ground, it transforms into grain and grapevines. A dog and a serpent lap at the blood, while a scorpion attacks the bull's genitals. Above it all, a raven perches, watching with the intensity of a divine messenger. This is Mithras, the unconquered sun, slaying the cosmic bull in the act that created the world. But the image is more complex than it first appears. The young god's face is turned away from the deed, expressing not triumph but sorrow, as if he understands the necessity of his action, but takes no pleasure in it. The bull's eyes are wide, with surprise rather than pain, as if it too understands that this is not mere slaughter, but cosmic transformation. The animals that surround the scene, the dog representing fidelity, the serpent representing wisdom, the scorpion representing the forces of chaos, are not random additions, but essential participants in the drama of creation. To understand why Roman men would crawl through tunnels and swear oaths of secrecy to worship this Persian god, you must understand the emptiness that traditional Roman religion had come to represent by the 2nd century. The transformation of Rome from republic to empire had fundamentally altered the relationship between the individual and the divine. The old gods Jupiter, Mars, Minerva had become primarily civic deities, their worship a matter of public duty rather than personal devotion. Picture the religious landscape of imperial Rome. The great temples that dominated the city's skyline were magnificent architectural achievements, their columns soaring toward the heavens, their interiors adorned with the finest sculptures and paintings that Greek and Roman artists could create. The festivals that marked the religious calendar were elaborate spectacles involving thousands of participants and drawing crowds from across the empire. Priests and augurs conducted their rituals with precision and grandeur, maintaining traditions that stretched back to the city's founding. Yet for all their magnificence, these public religions offered little comfort to the individual soul grappling with questions of mortality, purpose, and salvation. The state religion was about maintaining the favor of the gods for the empire as a whole. It had little to say about what happened to Marcus the centurion or Gaius the merchant when they died. A man might sacrifice a bull to Jupiter for the success of a military campaign, but Jupiter would not guide him through the darkness of personal loss or the fear of his own mortality. The philosophical schools that flourished in the empire, Stoicism, Epicureanism, Platonism, offered intellectual frameworks for understanding life's challenges, but they remained primarily the province of the educated elite. The average Roman, whether citizen or slave, freeman or patrician, found himself caught between the hollow rituals of state religion and the abstract theorizing of the philosophers, searching for something that could speak to both heart and mind, something that could offer not just explanation, but transformation. Into this spiritual vacuum stepped a host of mystery religions, each offering what the traditional gods could not: personal salvation, direct experience of the divine, and the promise of life after death. From Egypt came the cult of Isis, promising rebirth through identification with the goddess who had restored her murdered husband Osiris to life. From Asia Minor came the worship of Cybele, the Great Mother, whose devotees achieved ecstatic union with the divine through ritual castration and bloodletting. From Greece came the mysteries of Demeter at Eleusis, offering initiates a vision of the afterlife through symbolic death and resurrection. But Mithraism was different from these other mystery religions in crucial ways. Where the others welcomed both men and women, Mithraism was exclusively male. Where the others often emphasized the emotional and ecstatic aspects of religious experience, Mithraism stressed discipline, hierarchy, and rational understanding of cosmic truths. Where the others sometimes attracted the desperate and the marginalized, Mithraism appealed particularly to soldiers, civil servants, and others who served the imperial system, men who needed a religion that could coexist with their worldly responsibilities rather than demanding their withdrawal from society. The appeal to soldiers was particularly strong. A centurion serving on the Germanic frontier faced dangers that no amount of military training could fully prepare him for. Death could come at any moment, from a barbarian spear, from disease, from the simple accident of a horse stumbling on rocky ground. The traditional Roman religion offered him little comfort in such circumstances. He might sacrifice to Mars before a battle, but Mars would not promise him that death was merely a transition to a better life. He might invoke the genius of the emperor, but the emperor's divine protection seemed a frail thing when Germanic war cries echoed through the forest and arrows whistled overhead. Mithraism offered something different: a god who had himself faced death and emerged victorious, a cosmic drama in which every individual soul had a role to play, a promise that the struggles of this life were preparation for glories in the next. The centurion who worshipped Mithras knew that his god understood the soldier's life because Mithras himself was a warrior, locked in eternal combat with the forces of darkness and chaos. The initiation into Mithras's mysteries was not a single ceremony, but a journey through 7 grades, each representing a deeper understanding of the god's nature and the cosmic order he represented. The progression was carefully structured, with each grade building upon the knowledge and experiences of the previous ones. This was not a religion where emotional conversion could substitute for gradual spiritual development. It was a system that demanded years of study, practice, and proven commitment. The lowest grade was Korax, the raven, symbolized by the bird that appeared in the central myth. The raven was Mithras' messenger, the link between the divine realm and the world of men. New initiates at this level were servants to the higher grades, learning the basic symbols and stories of the faith while proving their worthiness for advancement. They might spend months or even years as ravens, gradually absorbing the rhythms of Mithraic worship while their sponsors evaluated their character and commitment. Above that came Nymphus, the bridegroom, representing the soul's marriage to the divine. At this level, initiates began to understand the deeper meanings of the bull-slaying myth, learning to interpret its symbols not just as historical events, but as ongoing spiritual realities. The bridegroom was wedded to truth, committed to a relationship with the divine that would transform every aspect of his earthly existence. The third grade was Miles, the soldier, particularly appropriate for the many military men who found their way into the mysteries. But this was not merely a recognition of worldly profession. It represented the spiritual warfare that every devotee must wage against the forces of ignorance and corruption. The soldier bore arms in the cosmic battle between light and darkness, understanding that his earthly military service was a reflection of deeper spiritual responsibilities. The higher grades were Persis, the Persian, acknowledging the religion's Eastern origins. Heliodromus, the Sunrunner, representing the soul's journey toward enlightenment. And finally Potter, the Father, who served as the community's priest and leader. Each grade had its own symbols, its own ritual responsibilities, its own secrets that were revealed only to those who had earned the right to know them. Imagine yourself as a candidate for initiation, perhaps a young soldier recently returned from campaign on the Germanic frontier. The horrors you have witnessed, the burning villages, the screams of women and children, the faces of men you have killed, have left you questioning everything you once believed about the meaning of life and death. Your centurion, himself a potter in the local Mithraeum, has observed your struggles with compassion and understanding. He has judged you worthy of consideration for the mysteries, but worthiness is not enough. You must prove your courage, your discretion, and your commitment to the Brotherhood. The selection process itself was rigorous. Sponsors were required to vouch not just for a candidate's character, but for his ability to keep secrets and his willingness to undergo ordeals that would test the limits of his endurance. The mysteries were not for the weak-willed or the curious. They were for men who had already proven themselves in the crucible of worldly experience and were ready to undertake an even more demanding spiritual journey. The initiation rituals themselves were closely guarded secrets known only to the initiated. But fragments of evidence from ancient sources, combined with archaeological discoveries and comparative studies of other mystery religions, suggest ordeals that tested both physical and mental endurance. Candidates might be required to fast for days, drinking only water and eating only bread while meditating on the sacred symbols. They might be required to remain sleepless for extended periods, using exhaustion to induce visionary states. They might undergo ritual purification with water and fire, symbolically burning away their old identity to prepare for spiritual rebirth. Some sources suggest that initiates were branded with hot irons, marking them permanently as servants of the unconquered sun. These brands were not randomly applied, but followed sacred patterns that encoded the initiate S grade and the stage of his spiritual development. The pain of branding was understood to be a form of sacrifice, a way of demonstrating commitment that went beyond mere words or promises. The most terrifying ordeal involved what scholars call the mystical death. Candidates were blindfolded and made to lie in a pit or coffin, covered with a shroud or wooden planks. They remained in this state of symbolic death for hours, sometimes days, experiencing visions that were believed to be communications from Mithras himself. The darkness was absolute, the silence complete, except for the sound of their own breathing and heartbeat. In this state of sensory deprivation, the boundary between self and cosmos began to dissolve, and candidates reported experiences of traveling through the celestial spheres, witnessing the battle between light and darkness, and receiving direct instruction from the god. Some candidates emerged from this ordeal transformed, filled with absolute certainty about their god's reality and their own salvation. They spoke of having seen the cosmic bull slaying with their own eyes, of having witnessed the moment when Mithras' sacrifice brought forth the grain and wine that sustained all life. They described journeys through the seven heavens, each ruled by one of the planetary gods, and their eventual arrival at the realm of the unconquered sun, where they received their spiritual names and learned their cosmic destinies. Others emerged broken, unable to cope with whatever they had experienced in the darkness. The visions induced by prolonged sensory deprivation could be overwhelming, especially for minds unprepared by years of gradual spiritual development. Some candidates abandoned their initiation at this point, returning to their ordinary lives with a deeper appreciation for the mysteries they had glimpsed but been unable to master. Others persevered, but required months of careful guidance before they could integrate their experiences into a coherent understanding of their spiritual path. But for those who successfully completed their initiation, the rewards were profound. Mithraism offered something that few other religions could match: a genuine community of equals bound together by shared secrets and mutual dependence. The bonds forged in the darkness of the Mithraeum were stronger than those of family, deeper than those of military service, more enduring than those of political alliance. In the Mithraeum, the rigid hierarchies of Romang society were suspended, replaced by a different kind of order based on spiritual achievement rather than worldly position. A slave who had earned the grade of potter outranked a senator who remained a mere corax. Military hierarchy, social position, wealth, none of these mattered in the sacred space beneath the earth. What mattered was the depth of one's understanding, the strength of one's commitment, and the purity of one's devotion to the unconquered sun. This revolutionary aspect of Mithraism should not be underestimated. Roman society was intensely hierarchical, with elaborate protocols governing the relationships between different social classes. The idea that a slave could exercise religious authority over his master was almost unthinkable in any other context. Yet in the Mithraeum, such reversals were not only possible but normative, reflecting the religion's fundamental teaching that spiritual development was more important than worldly achievement. The weekly gatherings of the Mithraic community followed a ritual pattern that had been established centuries earlier in the mountains of Persia. The potter, wearing the distinctive Phrygian cap that marked his rank, would lead the congregation in prayers and hymns sung in a mixture of Latin and Persian. The preservation of Persian elements in the liturgy was not merely traditional, but essential to the religion as effectiveness. The ancient language connected worshippers to the primordial revelation of Mithras, while its foreignness helped create the sense of otherworldliness that was central to the mysteries. The sacred space itself was carefully designed to reinforce the cosmic symbolism of the faith. The Mithraeum was understood to be a representation of the universe in miniature, with the ceiling painted to represent the vault of heaven, and the floor laid out to represent the earth below. The stone benches that lined the walls were arranged according to astrological principles, with each position corresponding to one of the 7 grades of initiation and one of the 7 planetary spheres. The central ritual was a sacred meal, eaten while reclining on these stone benches. But this was not the simple communion of early Christianity, or the festive banquets of other mystery religions. The Mithraic meal was a complex ritual drama that reenacted the cosmic processes by which Mithras sustained the world. Bread and wine were shared, but the bread was marked with symbols representing the cosmic order, the zodiac, the planetary spheres, the elements of earth, air, fire, and water. The wine was mixed with water and honey in proportions that held mystical significance, representing the transformation of the material world through divine sacrifice. Each participant understood his role in this cosmic drama. The potter represented Mithras himself, wielding the sacred dagger that had slain the cosmic bull. The other grades represented various aspects of the divine hierarchy, the heliodromus embodying the sun's life-giving power, the purses channeling the wisdom of the East, the miles maintaining the eternal vigilance against chaos and corruption. Even the lowest grades had essential roles, for the raven carried messages between the divine and human realms, while the bridegroom represented the soul's yearning for union with the divine. During these meals, the pater would recount the sacred stories of Mithras, not just the familiar tale of the bull slaying, but a complex mythology that explained the creation of the world, the ongoing battle between light and darkness, and the ultimate destiny of the faithful. These stories were not written down. They were passed from mouth to mouth, from potter to initiate, preserving their sacred character through the very act of oral transmission. The stories themselves were layered with meaning, operating simultaneously as historical accounts, cosmic allegories, and psychological insights. The bull slaying could be understood as the primordial sacrifice that brought the world into being, as the ongoing process by which spirit transforms matter, and as the internal struggle by which each individual must overcome his lower nature to achieve spiritual enlightenment. The various animals in the scene, the dog, the serpent, the scorpion, the raven represented different aspects of this transformation, different forces that must be mastered or enlisted in the service of spiritual development. The calendar of Mithraic festivals followed both Roman and Persian traditions, creating a complex rhythm of celebration that honored both the god's seismic significance and his particular relationship with his earthly devotees. The winter solstice was particularly important, marking the birthday of the unconquered sun and celebrating the return of light to the world. This was a time of joy and renewal, when initiates celebrated the victory of their god over the forces of darkness and chaos. But the most significant celebration was the Tauroctony, the ritual reenactment of the bull slaying that formed the center of Mithraic belief. This was not merely a commemorative ceremony, but a participation in the ongoing cosmic drama, a moment when the boundaries between past and present divine and human symbol and reality dissolved into a unity of experience that transformed all who witnessed it. Picture such a ceremony taking place in the depths of winter, when the Mithraeum would be the warmest place many of the participants would experience. The stone walls, heated by braziers and warmed by the press of bodies, would create an atmosphere of intense intimacy. The air would be thick with frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from Africa, exotic spices from the far reaches of the trade routes that connected Rome to the distant east. The light of oil lamps would flicker across the frescoed walls, making the painted figures seem to move and breathe with life. The potter, now wearing the mask of Mithras himself, would reenact the cosmic drama while the congregation chanted responses in the ancient Persian tone. The mask was not merely a costume piece, but a sacred object that transformed its wearer, allowing him to become the vehicle for divine presence. As he raised the ritual dagger, he was no longer Marcus the centurion or Gaius the merchant. He was the unconquered sun himself, performing the sacrifice that sustained the world. The other participants would take their roles as well, some representing the various animals in the scene, others embodying the cosmic forces that witnessed the great sacrifice. The boundaries between performer and audience, between ritual and reality, would dissolve as the Mithraeum became the cosmic cave where the primordial drama first unfolded. The mystery went deeper than ritual and ceremony. Mithraism was fundamentally a religion of salvation, offering its adherents the promise of eternal life through identification with their god. The bull slaying was not just a creation myth, but a pattern for spiritual transformation. Just as Mithras had slain the cosmic bull to create the world, so each initiate had to slay the bull of his own lower nature to achieve spiritual rebirth. The symbolism was complex and layered, requiring years of study to fully comprehend. The bull represented the material world, the realm of death and corruption that trapped the human soul. But it also represented the life force itself, the creative power that sustained the universe. The dagger was the will, guided by divine wisdom, that could cut through illusion to reach truth. But it was also sacrifice, the willingness to give up what was familiar and comfortable in order to achieve what was eternal and true. The blood that flowed from the wound was the life force itself, transformed through sacrifice into the grain and wine that sustained both body and spirit. This was not destruction, but transformation, not death, but rebirth, not loss, but the discovery of riches that had always been present, but hidden from ordinary perception. This was not a religion for the intellectually casual. Mithraism demanded study, contemplation, and a willingness to engage with ideas that challenged conventional thinking. Initiates were expected to master not just the ritual aspects of their faith, but its philosophical implications. The 7 grades of initiation corresponded to the 7 planets known to ancient astronomy. An advancement through the grades required understanding of how celestial movements affected earthly events. The religion incorporated elements of astrology, astronomy, and natural philosophy, creating a comprehensive worldview that could satisfy both emotional and intellectual needs. Initiates learned to read the movements of the stars as a divine language, to understand the correspondences between macrocosm and microcosm, to perceive the hidden connections that linked all aspects of creation into a unified whole. The secrecy that surrounded Mithraism was not merely a matter of exclusivity. It was essential to the religion as effectiveness. The mysteries lost their power if they became common knowledge. Sacred names became profane when spoken by uninitiated lips. Sacred symbols became mere decorations when their meaning was explained to the unprepared. The god's true name, the exact details of the initiation rituals, the inner meaning of the symbols that covered the Mithraeum. Walls, all of these were protected by oaths so solemn that breaking them was believed to bring not just social disgrace, but cosmic retribution. The oaths themselves were elaborate ritual performances that bound the initiate not just to secrecy, but to a way of life that embodied the values of the mysteries. Initiates swore to protect their brothers, to maintain the purity of the sacred spaces, to live in accordance with the cosmic order revealed by Mithras. They promised to face death without fear, to resist corruption without compromise, to serve the cause of light in the eternal battle against darkness. Yet this very secrecy also made Mithraism vulnerable in ways that its founders could not have foreseen. Unlike Christianity, which developed an extensive written tradition and could survive the loss of individual communities, Mithraism depended entirely on the oral transmission of its mysteries. The religion was like a river fed by countless underground springs, powerful and life-giving, as long as the sources remained intact, but vulnerable to catastrophic loss if those sources were cut off. When the Roman Empire adopted Christianity in the 4th century and began actively suppressing rival religions, Mithraism faced a crisis it could not overcome. Christian emperors closed the Mithraea, banned the rituals, and persecuted the devotees. But the real death blow came not from external persecution, but from internal collapse. As the old patterns died, their knowledge died with them. The carefully preserved traditions, the intricate symbolism, the sacred names and formulas, all vanished into the silence of the grave. The last potter died, taking his secrets with him. And within a few generations, the religion that had once competed with Christianity for the soul of the empire had vanished almost without trace. The elaborate underground temples were abandoned, their oil lamps extinguished forever, their frescoes left to fade in the darkness. The sacred meals were no longer shared, the hymns no longer sung, the mysteries no longer revealed to seeking souls. The archaeological evidence of Mithraism's presence is haunting in its incompleteness. Throughout the former Roman Empire, archaeologists have discovered more than 400 Mithraea, their walls still bearing the frescoes and reliefs that once guided the faithful through their spiritual journey. But the images raise more questions than they answer. What did the initiates see when they looked at the scorpion attacking the bull's genitals? What cosmic truth was represented by the raven's watchful presence? What promises of salvation were encoded in the grain and grapevines that sprang from the bull's blood? The artifacts tell us something of the religion's appeal and spread. Mithria have been found from Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain to the Euphrates frontier in the east, from the Rhine frontier in Germany to the Sahara frontier in North Africa. Each community adapted the basic pattern to local conditions, but the essential elements remained constant: the underground location, the astronomical symbolism, the central image of the bull slaying, the stone benches for the sacred meals. The London Mithraeum, discovered during construction work in 1954, preserved not just the architectural shell, but also a collection of sculptured heads that once decorated the temple. The faces stare out across the centuries with expressions of serene confidence, as if they still guard secrets that the world is not ready to know. The quality of the carving is exceptional, suggesting that the London community included wealthy and sophisticated members who spared no expense in creating a worthy dwelling for their god. Similar finds across Europe and the Mediterranean tell the same story. A religion that once commanded the devotion of thousands of men has become a collection of beautiful, mysterious artifacts that speak in a language we can no longer fully understand. The inscriptions that survive are tantalizingly incomplete, often providing names and titles, but rarely revealing the beliefs and practices that gave them meaning. Perhaps that is fitting. Mithraism was always a religion of the hidden, the mysterious, the deliberately obscure. Its adherents chose to worship in the darkness because they believed that truth was too powerful to be safely exposed to the light of common day. They descended into the earth because they understood that spiritual rebirth required a kind of death, a willingness to leave behind the surface world of appearances and descend into the realm where deeper truths waited to be discovered. The rhythm of their worship moved to the ancient cadences of Persia, carried by Roman soldiers from the frontier provinces to the heart of the empire, adapted to local needs, but never losing its essential character. In the end, when the empire itself crumbled and new gods demanded allegiance, the Mithraic mysteries followed their adherents into the silence of the grave, leaving behind only questions carved in stone and the faint echo of hymns sung in languages that no living voice remembers. Yet perhaps the silence itself is instructive. In a world that has grown accustomed to instant communication and universal access to information, there is something profoundly moving about a religion that valued secrecy above all else, that believed some truths were too sacred to be casually shared, that trusted the darkness to reveal what the light concealed. The empty Mithria stand as monuments not just to a lost faith, but to a different way of understanding the relationship between the sacred and the profane, between knowledge and wisdom, between the seeker and the sought. From the shadowy depths of underground mysteries, let us ascend once more into the light, but not the harsh, democratic light of the modern world. Instead, we climb marble steps worn smooth by generations of sandaled feet, past columns of porphyry and alabaster, into the rarefied atmosphere where Rome's oldest families breathed air that seemed different from that inhaled by common mortals. Here, in the sprawling villas of the Palatine Hill and the carefully manicured estates that dotted the countryside around Rome, lived the patricians' men and women whose bloodlines stretched back to the legendary founders of the city, whose names were carved in stone on monuments across the empire, and whose daily existence was both more luxurious and more constrained than you might imagine. The very architecture of their world spoke to this paradox of privilege and imprisonment. The domus of a great patrician family was not merely a residence, but a statement carved in stone and marble, its every detail proclaiming the owner as position in the social hierarchy, while simultaneously constraining his movements within carefully prescribed patterns. The atrium, with its impluvium collecting rainwater from the opening above, served as both the heart of family religious observance and the stage upon which the morning as political theater unfolded. The tablinum beyond, lined with wax masks of distinguished ancestors, was simultaneously a private study, and a public display of genealogical credentials that visitors were expected to admire and remember. Even the arrangement of rooms reflected the dual nature of patrician existence. Public spaces flowed seamlessly into private ones, but the boundaries between them were marked by subtle gradations of decoration and access that spoke volumes about Roman concepts of hierarchy and propriety. A client might be received in the atrium, a business associate in the tablinum, but only family members and the most intimate friends would be invited into the private quarters beyond. Yet even these supposedly private spaces were designed with an awareness that they might become public at any moment at a political crisis. A family celebration or a religious obligation might transform the most intimate chambers into stages for public performance. Picture yourself as Marcus Cornelius Scipio, bearer of one of Rome's most distinguished names, heir to a fortune built over centuries of military conquest and political maneuvering. It is dawn on a typical day, the 2nd century A.D., and you are awakening not to the gentle chime of an alarm clock or the gradual brightening of electric lights, but to the soft footfalls of slaves who have been preparing for your awakening since before the first cockerel crowed in the city below. But even this simple act of waking carries the weight of centuries of tradition and expectation. Your sleep itself has been shaped by the requirements of your position. The Roman day begins before dawn, when the first clients arrive to pay their respects and present their petitions. This means that your evening entertainments, no matter how elaborate, must end at an hour that allows for adequate rest, not because you personally require it, but because appearing before your clients and peers in anything less than perfect form would diminish not only your own reputation, but that of your entire family line. The discipline of early rising, maintained throughout your life, has become as natural as breathing, yet it remains a discipline nonetheless, a constant reminder that your time is not entirely your own. Your bedroom is a marvel of understated elegance, but every element has been chosen to serve multiple purposes beyond mere comfort. The walls are decorated with frescoes depicting pastoral scenes, shepherds tending their flocks in idealized landscapes that bear little resemblance to the harsh realities of actual farming. These images are not random decorative choices, but carefully selected representations of the golden age of simplicity and virtue that every Roman patrician claims to embody, despite living in luxury that would have been unimaginable to their rustic ancestors. The pastoral imagery serves as both decoration and moral instruction, a daily reminder of the values you are supposed to represent. The floor is covered with mosaics so intricate that each tiny tessera has been placed with the precision of a jeweler setting precious stones. The patterns themselves tell stories, geometric designs that represent the order and harmony that Rome has brought to the world, mythological scenes that demonstrate your cultural sophistication, historical episodes that celebrate your family's contributions to the empire's glory. Visitors to your bedroom, few though they may be, can read in these floors a complete narrative of your family's place in Roman history and their understanding of Roman values. Your bed, raised on a platform and draped with silk curtains imported from the distant kingdoms of the East, is more than a piece of furniture. It is a statement of your position in the world. The silk itself represents trade networks that span continents, economic relationships that your family's political connections have helped to establish and maintain. The exotic woods from which the bed frame is carved speak of military conquests in distant lands, of legions that have marched under standards bearing your family name. Even the design of the platform, which elevates you literally above the level of those who serve you, reflects the Roman understanding of hierarchy as a natural and divinely ordained principle. But even as you enjoy these luxuries, you are acutely aware that they come with a price. The same bloodline that entitles you to privilege also binds you with chains of expectation and duty that are in their own way as constraining as any slave's shackles. From the moment you drew your first breath, your life has been mapped out according to traditions older than the Colosseum. Patterns of behavior and achievement that you ignore at your peril. The weight of family history presses upon you with every decision, every public appearance, every private moment of choice. Your earliest memories are shaped by this awareness of destiny. As a child, you played not with simple toys, but with miniature versions of the equipment and symbols of your future roles. A tiny toga, a small replica of a senator's ivory chair toy soldiers, arranged in formations that mirror the great battles your ancestors fought. Your games were rehearsals for the serious business of adult life. Your childish competitions preparation for the political and social contests that would define your maturity. Your education, too, was designed not merely to inform your mind, but to shape your character according to patrician ideals. The Greek tutors who taught you rhetoric and philosophy, the Roman masters who instructed you in law and history, the military trainers who taught you swordsmanship and strategy, all of them understood that they were not simply imparting knowledge, but molding the future leader of one of one. Rome is great families. Every lesson carried moral as well as intellectual content. Every exercise was designed to strengthen not just your abilities, but your understanding of the responsibilities that would one day be yours. The ritual of dressing begins immediately upon waking, but it is far more than a simple matter of putting on clothes. Your personal slave, a Greek educated in rhetoric and philosophy who probably knows more about literature than most modern university graduates, approaches with your togan, not the simple white garment of popular imagination, but a complex piece of clothing whose proper arrangement requires both skill and patience. The toga praetexta of your youth, with its purple border indicating your noble birth, has given way to the pure white toga virilis of manhood, but the symbolism remains the same. You are not merely putting on clothes. You are assuming the visible markers of your class, your responsibilities, and your place in the cosmic order. The process of donning a toga properly takes nearly an hour, but this time is not wasted. As your body slave works, adjusting and readjusting the folds of fabric, you receive reports from other members of your household staff. The doorkeeper informs you of the clients who have already arrived for the morning salutation and those who have sent word that they will attend. Your secretary presents a summary of the correspondence that arrived during the night, highlighting items that require immediate attention. Your steward provides updates on the various business matters that require your decision before the day advances much further. The garment itself is a semicircle of wool measuring roughly 18 feet along its straight edge, and its arrangement requires precise folding, draping, and tucking to achieve the proper effect. One fold too many, and you appear sloppy. One fold too few, and you seem pretentious. The way the fabric falls across your left shoulder, the depth of the drape across your chest, the manner in which the hem brushes your feet, all of these details communicate information about your taste, your wealth, and your understanding of social propriety. But they also serve practical purposes that are not immediately obvious to the casual observer. The toga's cumbersome nature is not an accident, but a deliberate feature of its design. A man properly dressed in a toga cannot run, cannot fight, cannot engage in manual labor of any kind. The garment itself proclaims that its wearer is above such activities, that he commands others to perform them on his behalf. Yet this very impracticality also serves as a form of discipline, a constant reminder of the dignity and restraint that patrician status requires. The toga enforces the gravitas that Romans consider essential to proper leadership. While your body slave attends to these matters, others are preparing the various accessories that mark your rank. The senatorial ring of gold, passed down through generations of your family, slides onto your finger with the weight of ancestral achievement. This ring is not merely jewelry, but a seal of authority, used to authenticate documents and contracts that affect the lives of thousands of people across the empire. Its design incorporates symbols that tell the story of your family's rise to prominence, military standards, representing battlefield victories, architectural elements, representing the buildings your ancestors constructed for the public good, religious symbols. representing the priesthoods they held and the rituals they performed. The particular style of your sandals, the manner in which your hair is cut and arranged, the subtle scent of the oils with which your skin is anointed, each element has been chosen not for your personal preference, but for its appropriateness to your station. Even these seemingly minor details carry significance that extends far beyond mere fashion. Your sandals are crafted from leather, processed in workshops that your family owns, by slaves whose skills have been passed down through generations of service to your house. The oil that scents your skin is pressed from olives grown on your own estates, its particular fragrance immediately recognizable to those who know you well. Your hair is arranged in a style that indicates not only your social rank, but your political affiliations, your age, and your current circumstances. Your breakfast, served in the atrium of your villa, while the morning light filters through the compluvium above, reflects the same careful attention to propriety. The bread is made from the finest wheat, ground by your own mills and baked by slaves, whose sole responsibility is the preparation of your family as food. But this bread is far more than simple sustenance. The wheat from which it is made comes from estates in Egypt and Sicily that your family has owned for generations, their fertility a testament to the agricultural innovations that Roman engineering has brought to these conquered lands. The very act of eating this bread connects you to the vast networks of production and distribution that keep the empire fed and prosperous. The honey comes from hives maintained on your country estates, the wine from vineyards whose vines were planted by your great-grandfather. Even your morning meal is a demonstration of the self-sufficiency that marks true nobility. You consume nothing that does not ultimately derive from your own properties and enterprises. Yet this self-sufficiency is also a form of responsibility, requiring constant attention to the management of far-flung properties and the welfare of the thousands of workers who maintain them. The honey itself represents a particularly Roman approach to the relationship between civilization and nature. The hives on your estates are not wild, but carefully maintained, their productivity enhanced by techniques developed over centuries of Roman agricultural experimentation. The bees that produce your honey have been selected for their docility and productivity, their behavior modified through careful breeding and management. Even this simple pleasure of sweetened food represents the Roman conviction that nature exists to be improved by human intelligence and organization. But you cannot simply enjoy this meal in solitude. The salutatio, the morning reception, begins before you have finished eating. Clients who depend on your patronage for their livelihood arrive in carefully ordered succession, each bringing news, requests, or simply the tribute of their presence to acknowledge your superior position. This daily ritual is one of the most distinctively Roman of all social institutions, reflecting the empire's fundamental understanding of how power and responsibility should be distributed throughout society. The clients themselves represent every level of Roman society below your own exalted rank. A struggling poet hopes for a commission to write verses celebrating your family's achievements, his literary talents subordinated to the practical necessity of earning a living through the patronage of the great. A former soldier seeks your recommendation for a position in the civil service, his military service to the state now transformed into personal obligation to you. A provincial merchant requires your endorsement to secure a contract for supplying the legions, his commercial success dependent on your political connections. Each interaction follows a script as formal as a religious ceremony, but the formality serves purposes that extend far beyond mere etiquette. The clients approach with downcast eyes, addressing you with the elaborate courtesy that reinforces the social hierarchy, but their deference is not mere servility. It is an acknowledgement of the real services that your patronage provides and the genuine obligations that it creates. You respond with the gracious condescension that your position requires, neither too familiar nor too distant, offering enough encouragement to maintain their loyalty without committing yourself to obligations you cannot or will not fulfill. But even this carefully choreographed display of authority and benevolence carries risks that you must constantly navigate. A client whose petition you deny too harshly may become an enemy whose resentment could create future problems. A favor granted too readily may be seen as weakness, encouraging others to make increasingly unreasonable demands. The balance between generosity and firmness, between accessibility and dignity, requires constant adjustment based on your reading of each individual's character and circumstances. The Manning's business extends far beyond these personal audiences. Letters arrive from across the empire, carried by the efficient cursus publicus that connects Rome to its furthest provinces. A governor in Gaul requests your support for a new public works project. His success in that distant province partly dependent on the backing he can secure from influential senators in Rome. A general on the Danube frontier needs your influence to secure additional supplies for his legions. His military effectiveness directly tied to the political connections he can mobilize on his behalf. A fellow senator in Rome itself seeks your vote on upcoming legislation. His proposal has chances of passage, dependent on the complex web of favors and obligations that bind the senatorial class together. Each communication requires careful consideration, not merely of its immediate content, but of its implications for your family's long-term interests. Roman politics operates like a vast, three-dimensional chess game, where every move affects multiple relationships and where today's ally may become tomorrow's enemy. You must weigh the benefits of supporting the Gallic governor against the possibility that doing so might offend the senator who opposed him last year. You must consider whether backing the general as request might be seen as taking sides in a rivalry between different factions within the military command. The complexity of these calculations is increased by the fact that they must be made quickly, often with incomplete information, and always with an awareness that your decisions will be scrutinized by friends and enemies alike for signs of weakness, inconsistency, or dangerous ambition. A letter that arrives with the morning dispatches may require an answer before noon, leaving little time for the careful consultation and deliberation that such important matters would seem to require. Your morning rounds through the city provide little respite from these calculations. Traveling in a litter carried by 8 carefully matched slaves, you make your way through streets that part before your procession like water before the prow of a ship. But even this luxury comes with obligations. The litter bearers must be properly trained, uniformly dressed, and physically impressive. Their appearance reflects on your status as surely as your own clothing. The route you take, the people you acknowledge with a nod or a gesture, the buildings you choose to pass, all of these choices communicate messages about your alliances, your preferences, and your position within the complex web of Roman social relationships. The litter itself is a masterpiece of craftsmanship that represents the coordinated efforts of dozens of specialists. The frame is made from rare woods imported from distant provinces, its joints fitted with a precision that allows it to flex with the movements of the bearers, while maintaining perfect stability for its occupant. The curtains that can be drawn to provide privacy are woven from silk dyed with colors so expensive that their cost could feed a family of commoners for a year. The interior cushions are stuffed with down from birds that nest in the mountains of the far north, their softness a luxury that even wealthy merchants cannot afford. Yet for all its magnificence, the litter also serves as a kind of mobile prison, isolating you from direct contact with the streets through which you pass, while making you visible to all who witness your passage. You see the city and its inhabitants, but only through the filter of your elevated position and protected status. The problems and pleasures of ordinary life unfold before you like scenes in a play, observed but not directly experienced. Your first stop is the Forum Romanum, where business and politics interweave like the threads of an elaborate tapestry. Here, beneath the shadow of ancient temples and between the marble columns of newer basilicas, you conduct the affairs that maintain your family's position in Roman society. A meeting with fellow senators to discuss upcoming legislation, a conference with bankers about investments in provincial trade, a consultation with architects about improvements to your country villa. Each activity reinforces the networks of obligation and mutual interest that hold the elite together. The Forum itself, with its ancient monuments and newer additions, provides a constant reminder of the layers of history that shape contemporary Roman life. The simple altar of Vesta, where the sacred fire has burned for centuries, stands near the elaborate arch of Septimius Severus, its reliefs celebrating military victories that occurred within living memory. The Curia, where the Senate meets, has been rebuilt several times, but its current magnificence reflects the restored authority that Augustus gave to that ancient institution. Every building, every statue, every inscription tells part of the story of Roman achievement, creating an environment where the weight of tradition presses upon every conversation and decision. But even as you move through these familiar routines, conducting business in spaces that your ancestors have used for the same purposes for generations, you are acutely conscious of the precarious nature of your position. Roman history is littered with the wreckage of great families that fell from favor through a single misjudgment, a single moment of being on the wrong side of imperial displeasure. The Iuli, the Claudi, the Flavii dynasties, at once seemed as permanent as the seven hills themselves have vanished, their names surviving only in the history books that chronicle their rise and fall. This awareness of mortality, both personal and familial, lends an edge of urgency to all your activities. The villa you are improving may outlast you, but will it survive the political upheavals that seem to sweep away even the most established families with disturbing regularity? The alliances you are cultivating today may prove worthless tomorrow if the balance of power shifts in unexpected ways. The wealth you are accumulating may be confiscated by a future emperor who sees your family as a threat to his authority. The afternoon brings different responsibilities, but no less demanding ones. At your villa outside the city, you preside over the management of estates that employ hundreds of workers and generate the wealth that sustains your urban lifestyle. The vineyard overseer reports on the previous year's harvest and requests authorization to purchase new slaves for the upcoming season. The olive grove manager presents his accounts, showing the profits from oil sales across the Mediterranean. The steward of your grain-producing properties in Sicily sends word of negotiations with Roman merchants who want to secure exclusive contracts for their shipments. Each decision you make ripples outward through the economic life of the empire. Your choice to expand wine production might affect grape prices from Gaul to Egypt. Your decision to invest in new shipping ventures could influence trade routes that connect Britain to the Black Sea. The slaves you purchase, the crops you choose to plant, the improvements you make to your properties, all of these actions contribute to the vast economic machine that keeps the Roman world functioning. Yet the management of these vast enterprises requires skills and knowledge that extend far beyond the traditional education of a Roman aristocrat. You must understand agricultural techniques, market conditions, transportation logistics, and financial instruments with a sophistication that would impress modern business executives. The romantic image of the Roman patrician as a cultured gentleman who leaves practical matters to others dissolves under the pressure of real responsibility for complex economic enterprises that span continents. The slaves who work your estates are not simply anonymous laborers, but individuals whose skills, personalities, and loyalties you must constantly evaluate and cultivate. A talented vineyard worker might be promoted to overseer, but only if his character as well as his abilities warrant such trust. A household slave who shows promise might be given additional education, perhaps eventually earning manumission and becoming a valued freedman whose loyalty to your family extends beyond the legal obligations of servitude. Yet for all your wealth and influence, you remain fundamentally dependent on others. Your fortune rests on the labor of slaves whose loyalty you must constantly cultivate and whose rebellion you must constantly fear. Your political position depends on the favor of emperors whose whims can change as quickly as Mediterranean weather. Your social standing requires the recognition of peers who are simultaneously your allies and your competitors. This web of dependencies creates a constant state of tension that affects every aspect of your daily life. The slave who serves your food might harbor resentments that could lead to poison in your cup. The emperor whose favor you cultivate today might tomorrow see your family as prominence, as a threat to his own security. The senator whose friendship you value might secretly be working to undermine your position for reasons you cannot even guess. The evening's entertainment reflects these same tensions between luxury and constraint. A dinner party at your villa brings together 24 of Rome's most distinguished citizens, but the guest list itself represents weeks of careful negotiation. Who can be seated next to whom without causing offense? Which topics of conversation are safe and which might trigger dangerous political discussions? How can you demonstrate your wealth and taste without appearing ostentatious or, worse, threatening to those in even higher positions? A meal itself is a masterpiece of culinary art and logistical complexity. The first course features delicacies from across the known world: oysters from Britain, dates from Egypt, spices from India, wines from the Greek islands. But each exotic ingredient represents not just wealth, but connections. The British oysters arrive fresh because you have arrangements with merchants who specialize in rapid transport of perishables. The Egyptian dates are the finest available because your family has relationships with producers that go back generations. The Indian spices are perfectly prepared because your cook has been trained by specialists who understand their proper use. The presentation is as important as the taste: peacocks roasted and re-feathered to appear alive, pigs stuffed with songbirds, honey cakes molded into the shapes of famous buildings. Each dish tells a story about your connections, your resources, and your sophisticated understanding of what constitutes proper luxury. But these elaborate presentations also serve practical purposes, demonstrating to your guests the extent of your household's capabilities and the depth of your commitment to honoring them appropriately. But even as your guests recline on couches of ivory and gold, sampling delicacies that most Romans never dream of tasting, the conversation follows carefully established patterns. Politics must be discussed, but not too explicitly. Everyone needs to understand the current state of affairs, but no one can afford to be quoted making statements that might later be used against them. Literature and philosophy provide safer ground, but even here you must be careful not to express views that might be interpreted as criticism of the current regime or support for dangerous ideas. Personal gossip is entertaining, but dangerous today, as amusing anecdote about a rival's marital difficulties might become tomorrow as weapon in a political struggle. Stories about mutual acquaintances must be chosen carefully, ensuring that they entertain without creating enemies or revealing information that others might prefer to keep private. Even praise of absent friends must be measured, since excessive enthusiasm for one person might be interpreted as criticism of others. The entertainment that follows dinner reflects the same careful balance between display and discretion. Musicians perform compositions that demonstrate your cultural refinement without challenging anyone's moral sensibilities. The music must be sophisticated enough to show your good taste, but not so complex or avant-garde as to suggest dangerous intellectual pretensions. Dancers execute movements that are sensual enough to please your male guests, but restrained enough to avoid shocking their wives or creating gossip that might damage your reputation for maintaining proper household discipline. Poets recite verses that celebrate traditional Roman virtues while avoiding any topics that might be construed as contemporary commentary. The poems themselves are often commissioned works created specifically for occasions like this. Their content carefully crafted to reinforce the values and relationships that bind your social circle together, while avoiding any statements that might later prove embarrassing or dangerous. As the evening progresses and wine loosens tongues, you must remain perpetually alert. A seemingly innocent comment about military strategy might reveal classified information about frontier defenses. A casual observation about taxation could be interpreted as criticism of imperial policy. An offhand remark about another guest's business dealings might trigger a feud that could last for generations. Your role as host requires you to guide the conversation, deflecting dangerous topics while encouraging the kind of discussion that strengthens social bonds without creating political risks. The burden of maintaining this constant vigilance extends into your most private moments. Your marriage, arranged in childhood to strengthen alliances between great families, must appear harmonious regardless of your personal feelings. Your wife, herself the product of patrician upbringing, understands the role she must play in public, but the strain of maintaining appearances inevitably affects your relationship in ways that outsiders never see. Your children's education, their friendships, their eventual marriages, all of these intimate family matters are also political decisions that affect your clan's future prospects. Your son's choice of tutors reflects not only on his intellectual development, but on your family's cultural values and political affiliations. Your daughter's companions must be chosen from families whose friendship will benefit rather than compromise your position. Even their childhood games and casual conversations are influenced by the awareness that they are being prepared for lives of public responsibility and scrutiny. Even your choice of reading material is scrutinized. The wrong book in your library could be evidence of dangerous thinking. The scrolls and codices that line the walls of your study are not simply sources of personal enjoyment, but statements about your intellectual interests and moral character. A work of philosophy that questions traditional values, a history that presents unflattering portraits of previous emperors, a collection of poetry that celebrates themes incompatible with official ideology. Any of these could provide ammunition for enemies who seek to destroy your reputation and undermine your position. Your country estates provide some relief from the intensity of urban life, but they bring their own challenges. Here, among the olive groves and vineyards that stretch toward distant hills, you must play the role of the benevolent patriarch, overseeing the welfare of hundreds of slaves and freedmen whose lives depend entirely on your decisions. The pastoral setting might seem to offer escape from political pressures, but in reality, it simply presents those pressures in a different form. The steward reports that one of your field hands has been caught stealing grain. Do you order the traditional punishment of crucifixion, or do you show mercy that might be interpreted as weakness? The decision affects not only the individual involved, but the morale and discipline of your entire workforce. Too harsh a punishment might breed resentment that could lead to more serious problems. Too lenient a response might encourage others to test the boundaries of acceptable behavior. A young slave girl in your household has caught the eye of your son. Do you arrange for her to be sold to prevent complications? Or do you acknowledge the liaison and deal with its consequences? The choice involves considerations of family honor, household discipline, and the practical management of relationships that could affect your estate's operation for years to come. Your son's feelings, the girl's welfare, and the opinions of other family members must all be weighed against the broader implications of whatever decision you make. These decisions, made in the peaceful setting of your rural retreat, affect real human lives in ways that your urban political maneuvering rarely does. The slave whose fate you decide with a casual gesture, the freedman whose petition you grant or deny, the tenant farmer whose rent you choose to raise or lower. These people exist at your pleasure, their futures entirely dependent on your whims and calculations. The responsibility is both intoxicating and crushing, a constant reminder of the power that comes with your position, and the burden of using that power wisely. Yet even in this environment where your word is law, you remain bound by the expectations of your class. The villa itself, with its elaborate gardens and expensive artworks, serves as much to impress visitors as to provide personal comfort. The hunts you organize, the festivals you sponsor, the improvements you make to local infrastructure, all of these activities are performances designed to reinforce your position as the natural leader of the community. The seasonal round of activities that structures your year reflects the same tension between privilege and obligation. Spring brings the opportunity to travel to your various properties, inspecting the damage of winter and planning improvements for the coming year. But these journeys are not simply pleasant excursions. They are essential business trips that require careful scheduling, extensive preparation, and constant attention to the political implications of your movements. Summer offers the pleasures of seaside villas on the Bay of Naples, where you can escape Rome's heat while maintaining the social connections that keep you informed of political developments. But even this supposed relaxation involves a complex schedule of visits, entertainments, and conferences that serve to reinforce relationships and gather information that will be crucial when you return to the city for the active political season. Autumn demands your presence at harvest festivals and religious ceremonies. That marked your role as both landowner and community leader. These occasions might seem like simple celebrations of agricultural success, but they are actually elaborate rituals to reinforce the social bonds between you and the people who depend on your leadership, while demonstrating to neighboring communities your wealth, generosity, and commitment to traditional values. Winter returns you to the city for the legislative season, when the Senate meets and important decisions about the empire's future are made. This is the time when all the relationships you have cultivated, all the favors you have granted, and all the obligations you have incurred throughout the year come into play as you participate in the complex process by which Rome governs its vast territories and diverse populations. Throughout this cycle, you are constantly performing the role of the ideal Roman aristocrat, cultured but not effete, wealthy but not ostentatious, powerful but not tyrannical. Every public appearance, every social interaction, every business decision must conform to standards that have been refined over centuries of aristocratic tradition. To step outside these bounds, even briefly, is to risk not just personal embarrassment, but the diminishment of your family's reputation for generations to come. The weight of this responsibility shapes your inner life as profoundly as it governs your external behavior. You have been trained from childhood to suppress personal desires in favor of family obligations, to value duty over happiness, to see yourself not as an individual, but as the temporary custodian of an ancient legacy. Your thoughts, your emotions, your very sense of identity are molded by the expectations that come with your bloodline and your position. In quiet moments, perhaps while walking alone through your villa's gardens in the early morning light, you might wonder what your life would have been like if you had been born into a different class. The freedom to choose your own occupation, to marry for love rather than alliance, to express your opinions without calculating their political implications. These simple pleasures of ordinary life are as foreign to your experience as the luxuries you enjoy are foreign to theirs. But such thoughts are brief and quickly suppressed. You are a patrician, heir to centuries of tradition, and power, guardian of values and institutions that have made Rome the master of the known world. The privileges you enjoy are inseparable from the responsibilities you bear, the luxuries you consume balanced by the constraints you accept. This is the bargain that your ancestors made with history, and it is the bargain that you must honor in your turn. The rhythm of your life moves to the ancient cadences of Roman tradition. Each day, a variation on themes established by generations of predecessors, each choice circumscribed by the accumulated weight of family honor and social expectation. In the end, perhaps this is what it truly meant to be a patrician in imperial Rome, to live a life of magnificent constraint, enjoying unlimited luxury within strictly limited bounds, wielding enormous power according to rules you dare not break. And so our journey through the intimate corners of ancient Rome draws to its close, like the last flicker of an oil lamp in a marble corridor that has grown cold with the passage of centuries. The flame wavers, casting dancing shadows on walls that once echoed with laughter and conversation, now silent witnesses to the inexorable march of time. We have walked together through the steamy chaos of public baths, where privacy was a foreign concept and hygiene was a gamble with fate, where the wealthy and the common citizen stood naked beside each other in the Caldarium's oppressive heat. Their social distinctions momentarily dissolved in the equalizing steam, their bodies bearing the same vulnerabilities that unite all humanity across the centuries. We have sat in the shadows with Seneca, watching a brilliant mind wrestle with the impossible contradictions of power and principle. Observing as one of history's most profound philosophers struggled to reconcile his Stoic ideals with the brutal realities of imperial service. His letters, penned in the quiet hours between political obligations, reveal a soul torn between the serene wisdom he preached and the compromises he made to survive in Nero's court. In those private moments of reflection, we see him as more than a historical figure. We see him as a human being grappling with the eternal question of how to live with integrity in an imperfect world, how to maintain one's moral center when the very foundations of society seem to shift beneath one's feet. We have descended into the mysterious depths where men sought salvation in the darkness, bound together by secrets that died with their last believers. In those underground sanctuaries dedicated to Mithras, we have witnessed the profound human hunger for meaning that transcends the material world, the desperate search for transformation that drives people to gather in hidden places, to speak in whispers, to pledge themselves to mysteries that promise redemption. The initiated who gathered in these subterranean temples were not so different from seekers in any age. They were people who felt the inadequacy of surface existence, who yearned for something deeper, something that could give shape and purpose to lives that might otherwise feel meaningless in the vast machinery of empire. And we have climbed the marble steps to the heights of privilege, where golden chains proved heavier than iron ones. In the magnificent villas of the patrician class, surrounded by art looted from conquered territories, and served by slaves whose own stories remain largely untold, we have observed how wealth and status create their own forms of imprisonment. The elaborate social rituals, the constant performance of superiority, the exhausting maintenance of position, all of these demanded a kind of spiritual sacrifice that left even the most successful Romans questioning whether their achievements had brought them closer to or further from genuine happiness. The distance between their world and ours is vast, measured not just in years, but in fundamental assumptions about how life should be lived, what comforts we deserve, what obligations we owe to one another, what constitutes a meaningful existence. Their world was one where slavery was unquestioned, where gladiatorial combat was entertainment, where the whims of emperors could reshape entire provinces overnight. They lived with a casual acceptance of violence that would shock most modern sensibilities. Yet they also possessed a sophisticated understanding of duty, honor, and civic responsibility that might humble our own age. They built roads that lasted millennia, and aqueducts that still inspire engineers. Yet they also built an empire on the subjugation of countless peoples, whose cultures they simultaneously absorbed and destroyed. Yet in following these ancient Romans through their daily routines, their moral struggles, their spiritual searches, and their social performances, perhaps we glimpse something that transcends the centuries: the eternal human effort to find meaning, connection, and dignity within whatever circumstances history has provided. Whether they were rising before dawn to tend to business in the forum, gathering with friends for literary discussions in private gardens, participating in religious festivals that connected them to something larger than themselves, or simply trying to raise their children with values that would serve them well in an uncertain world, they were engaged in the same fundamental human project. Occupies us today the attempt to create lives worth living. The Bathhouse crowds dispersed long ago, their voices silent, their bodies returned to dust. Those steamy chambers that once rang with gossip and laughter, with political scheming and philosophical debate, now lie in ruins, their elaborate heating systems cold, their marble floors cracked by time and weather. The sophisticated engineering that brought hot water to every corner of the empire has given way to simpler technologies. Yet the human need for cleansing, for community, for the ritual renewal that water provides, continues in different forms. We may bathe alone now, in private spaces with clean water and effective soap, but we still seek out communal experiences where we can shed the armor of daily life and connect with others in more fundamental ways. Seneca's philosophical struggles ended in that heated bath where his blood mingled with the warm water, where the great advocate of Stoic acceptance faced his final test and chose death over dishonor. His last hours, as recorded by Tacitus, reveal a man striving to live up to his own teachings, even as his body failed him, demonstrating that philosophy is not merely an intellectual exercise, but a way of being in the world that must be tested in the crucible of experience. His death was both deeply Roman, bound up with questions of honor, loyalty, and political necessity, and universally human in its confrontation with mortality, its attempt to find dignity in the face of inevitable dissolution. The last Mithraic mysteries were spoken in whispers that faded into eternal silence, their sacred texts lost, their ritual objects buried or destroyed, their initiates taking their secrets to unmarked graves. Yet the hunger that drove those ancient seekers to gather in underground temples persists in different forms. We may not worship the bull-slaying god in subterranean chambers, but we still search for experiences that transform us, that connect us to something greater, that our individual concerns, that offer hope for redemption and renewal. The specific content of mystery religions may strike us as alien, but the impulse they served, the need for spiritual community, for ritual transformation, for direct encounter with the sacred, remains as powerful today as it was 2,000 years ago. The great patrician villas crumbled, their marble columns toppled, their frescoed walls worn smooth by wind and rain, their elaborate gardens returning to wilderness. The wealth that built these monuments to human ambition proved as ephemeral as the people who accumulated it. Yet the questions that troubled those ancient aristocrats: how should privilege be used? What obligations come with power? How do we find authentic happiness amid luxury and comfort? Continue to challenge those who inherit advantages in any age. The specific forms of Roman privilege may have vanished, but the moral challenges of wealth and status remain remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries. But the rhythm of their lives, a constant human dance between comfort and constraint, between individual desire and social obligation, between the search for meaning and the necessity of survival, continues in different forms, in different places, with different players. This rhythm manifests in the daily negotiations we all make between what we want and what we can have, between our private dreams and our public responsibilities, between our need for security and our hunger for transcendence. The Romans who rose each morning to face another day of navigating complex social hierarchies, managing household economies, maintaining relationships, and seeking moments of beauty or insight, were engaged in fundamentally the same project that occupies modern people everywhere. We bathe in private now, with clean water and effective soap, yet we still gather in public spaces where we negotiate the delicate balance between solitude and community. Our coffee shops and gyms, our parks and shopping centers serve some of the same social functions as Roman baths. They are places where we encounter others, outside our immediate circles, where we observe and are observed, where we participate in the ongoing human drama of connection and recognition. We may not discuss philosophy while naked in steamy chambers, but we still seek venues where conversation can flourish, where ideas can be exchanged, where the isolation of modern life can be temporarily overcome through shared experience. We no longer serve emperors who can order our deaths on a whim, yet we still grapple with the gap between our ideals and our compromises. Every person who has ever held a job that required moral flexibility, who has ever remained silent when speaking up might have been costly, who has ever chosen security over principle, understands something of what Seneca faced in Nero's court. The specific forms of power may have changed, but the fundamental challenge of maintaining integrity while navigating hierarchical institutions remains constant. We may not fear execution for our opinions, but we still face subtler forms of coercion that test our commitment to our values. We may not worship in underground temples, but we still seek transformation, purpose, and belonging in communities that offer both inclusion and constraint. Whether we find these communities in religious congregations, political movements, professional organizations, or informal networks of friends and colleagues, we are still responding to the same human needs that drove ancient Romans to participate in mystery religions. We want to belong to something larger than ourselves. We want to believe that our lives have significance beyond our individual concerns. And we want to share that belief with others who understand and support our search for meaning. The patricians of ancient Rome would find our world as strange and challenging as we find theirs. Our democratic assumptions as foreign to them as their aristocratic certainties are to us. They would be bewildered by societies that claim equality as a fundamental principle, by systems of government that derive authority from popular consent rather than divine appointment or military conquest. They would struggle to understand how people who have never demonstrated their fitness to rule through wealth, education, or noble birth could claim the right to make decisions about public policy. Yet they would also recognize the inefficiencies and corruptions that plague democratic systems, the ways in which popular government can become mob rule, the difficulty of making wise decisions through collective processes. Yet they would recognize the fundamental challenges. How do we live well in an imperfect world? How do we balance personal happiness with social responsibility? How do we find meaning in the face of mortality? These questions haunted Roman philosophers and statesmen, just as they challenge thoughtful people today. The Roman emphasis on duty, honor, and service to the common good speaks to concerns that remain relevant in any society where individual interests must be balanced against collective needs. Their recognition that virtue requires practice, that character is built through repeated choices, that wisdom comes only through experience, these insights transcend cultural and temporal boundaries. The Romans understood that living well required more than material success or personal satisfaction. It demanded engagement with the larger human community, acceptance of responsibility for the welfare of others, and recognition that individual flourishing depends on social stability. They may have defined citizenship more narrowly than we do, and they may have accepted inequalities that we reject, but their core insight, that human beings are political animals who find their deepest fulfillment through participation in communal life, remains profoundly relevant. Let these ancient voices accompany you now toward rest, their stories joining the vast chorus of human experience that connects us across the centuries. Imagine them not as distant historical figures, but as fellow travelers on the same human journey, people who faced the morning with the same mixture of hope and anxiety that we experience, who tried to make sense of their circumstances with the same combination of reason and intuition that we employ, who sought connection and understanding with the same urgency that drives us to reach out to others across the barriers of time and culture. Their voices speak to us from fragments of letters, from inscriptions on tombstones, from the ruins of buildings they inhabited, from the artifacts they left behind. They tell us about love and loss, about ambition and disappointment, about moments of transcendence and periods of despair. They remind us that the human experience, despite its infinite variations across time and place, contains certain constants: the need for love, the search for purpose, the desire for dignity, the hope for something better than what we have inherited. In the end, perhaps that is the most profound lesson they offer, not the details of their particular struggles, but the reminder that the human story continues, that each generation faces the eternal challenges in its own way, that the rhythm of life itself endures even as its individual manifestations fade into memory. They show us that it is possible to live with dignity even under difficult circumstances, to maintain hope even in the face of disappointment, to find meaning even when the larger structures of society seem corrupt or failing. They also show us the price of compromise, the weight of complicity, the cost of seeking security through accommodation with unjust systems. Their struggles with conscience remind us that moral choices are rarely simple, that good people can become entangled in evil systems, that the gap between ideal and reality is a permanent feature of human existence, rather than a problem that can be definitively solved. Rest well, knowing that the questions they wrestled with still await our answers, and that the dignity they sought in their daily lives remains available to us in ours. The bathhouses are empty now, but the search for cleanliness continues, not just physical cleanliness, but the deeper purification that comes from honest self-examination, from the willingness to acknowledge our failings and try to do better. The sophisticated engineering that supplied Roman baths with hot water has been replaced by technologies they could never have imagined. Yet the fundamental human need for renewal, for the ritual of washing away the day's accumulation of disappointment and compromise, remains unchanged. The philosophers have fallen silent, but wisdom still calls to those who would listen. Seneca's letters continue to find new readers because the questions he explored: how should we respond to suffering? What do we owe to others? How can we find peace in turbulent times? Are questions that every generation must answer for itself. His insights into the human condition speak across centuries because human nature itself remains relatively constant despite changes in technology, politics, and social organization. The specific circumstances that challenged Roman Stoics may have disappeared, but the need for philosophical reflection, for systematic thinking about how to live well, persists in every age. The mystery religions have faded, but the human hunger for transcendence endures. We may not gather in underground temples to share sacred meals and perform ritual dramas, but we still seek experiences that lift us beyond the mundane concerns of daily life, that connect us to sources of meaning that transcend our individual mortality. Whether we find these experiences in traditional religious observances, in artistic creation and appreciation, in the contemplation of natural beauty, or in moments of human connection that touch something eternal within us, we are responding to the same deep need that drove ancient Romans to seek initiation into the mysteries of Mithras, Isis, or Dionysus. The great houses have crumbled, but the challenge of living well with power and privilege remains. Every person who inherits advantages, whether through birth, talent, circumstance, or effort, faces the same questions that troubled thoughtful patricians. How should these advantages be used? What do we owe to those who have less? How do we maintain perspective about our own accomplishments? How do we find authentic satisfaction rather than the hollow pleasure that comes from mere accumulation or status? The Roman villa may have given way to other forms of privilege, but the moral challenges of wealth and power remain surprisingly consistent across cultures and centuries. In the quiet space between waking and sleeping, between their world and ours, let their stories remind you that we are all participants in the same ancient drama, playing our parts as best we can, seeking connection and meaning in whatever circumstances. We inherit, adding our own small chapters to the endless human story that stretches from the first stirring of consciousness to whatever future awaits. This drama has countless acts, but a consistent theme: the attempt of conscious beings to find purpose, to create beauty, to love and be loved, to leave something valuable for those who come after. The Romans, who lived through the transformation of republic into empire, who witnessed the rise and fall of emperors, who saw their familiar world change beyond recognition, understood something important about historical change: that individuals cannot control the larger forces that shape their times, but they can control how they respond to those forces. They can choose to act with integrity or to compromise their principles, to serve the common good or to pursue only personal advantage, to face adversity with courage or to be overcome by fear and despair. Their example reminds us that history is made not only by famous leaders and dramatic events, but also by the countless small choices made by ordinary people trying to live decent lives under difficult circumstances. The Roman merchant who dealt honestly with his customers, the mother who taught her children to value virtue over success, the slave who maintained his dignity despite his bondage, the soldier who protected civilians rather than exploiting his power. These people whose names are mostly lost to history were the ones who preserved whatever was best in Roman civilization and transmitted it to future generations. Sleep peacefully, traveler of the modern world, knowing that you are part of something larger than yourself, something that connects you to every Ramang who ever drew breath in the shadow of the seven hills, and to every human being who will draw breath long after our own stories have faded into the gentle silence of history. This connection is not merely sentimental, it is the recognition that consciousness itself, the ability to reflect on experience and choose how to respond to it, is the thread that links all human generations across time and space. You carry within yourself the same capacity for reason and compassion that enabled the best Romans to rise above the limitations of their time to envision better ways of living, to act with nobility, even when nobility was neither rewarded nor recognized. You also carry the same susceptibility to fear, greed, and self-deception that led other Romans to participate in or acquiesce to the cruelties of their age. The difference between these responses lies not in circumstances, but in choices, the countless, small decisions that shape character and determine whether we contribute to human flourishing or human suffering. As you rest, let the knowledge of this connection bring not burden but comfort, the comfort of knowing that you are not alone in your struggles, that others have faced similar challenges and found ways to maintain hope and dignity, that the human capacity for growth and redemption persists even in the darkest times. The light that guided the best Romans toward wisdom and compassion is the same light that can guide us today if we choose to follow it. The questions they asked about how to live well are the same questions we must answer for ourselves. But we do not answer them in isolation. We answer them as part of a continuing conversation that began when humans first became capable of reflection and will continue as long as consciousness persists in the universe.